Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Betting Big, Investing in Emerging Energy Technology virtual workshop. I'm Brittany Smart, the Energy Transitions Initiative Coordinator at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, which is the primary sponsor of this workshop series. And I'll be your MC today. Thank you so much for joining us. Yesterday, we had folks join us from Delaware, Washington, Hawaii, South Carolina, Oregon, Minnesota, Indiana, New Mexico, and of course, from around Alaska. For those of you that missed yesterday, this workshop will be available online in the next week or so. Please keep an eye out on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website for the recording. This is the third in a series of 3 virtual workshops. They have been held monthly as 2 half-day Zoom sessions free of charge, leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is taking place in person from May 20th to 23rd at the Denina Center in Anchorage, Alaska. The purpose of these workshops is to take a deeper dive into specific topics that are of current relevance to the energy opportunities and challenges facing Alaska today. This is the 3rd year that ACEP has hosted these workshops. We bring some of the top experts and practitioners together to share information and their perspectives on issues that are of interest as we work towards Alaska's energy future. All of the workshops are recorded, and you can find them on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website. Previous topics have included nuclear energy in Alaska, ocean and river energy, hydrogen, low carbon energy transitions, carbon capture and sequestration, and energy storage. We have posted the link in chat in case you'd like to revisit any of those topics. For this year's workshops, we took a different approach. Rather than focusing on the different technologies, we look at the broader picture of our energy system. Last month, we focused on transmission and distribution, the clean energy transition secret weapon. We heard from different perspectives and approaches regarding how our energy transmission and distribution systems are critical aspects of energy infrastructure and are essential for driving sustainable change in Alaska's energy future. For this workshop, we are focused on betting big, investing in emerging energy technology. We hope you'll join us in a few weeks for the 2024 Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference itself. Both in-person and virtual tickets can be purchased now at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com. You can find the link in the chat. We hope you'll consider joining us. Following today's program, we will also be sharing a survey to gain your feedback on this workshop. Everyone who completes the survey will be entered to win 1 3-day conference ticket, in person or virtual, to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. So stick around and be sure to get your short survey submitted. Yesterday, we heard from the University of Washington capstone students on their project, Efficient Energy Research, Building an Advanced Language Model and Interface. That was followed by a very engaging conversation on the role of AI, opportunities and considerations with Leslie Canavera with Pole Arctic, Richard Lum with Vision Foresight Strategy, and Clay Coughlin with the Cordova Electric Association. We then heard from Jay Byam, CEO of Cartorium, on digital twins, where to start. We closed out the day hearing from Laurent Nassif on hydrogen deployments and blending. Today, we're going to build on that conversation. We'll learn about the Krafla Magma Testbed, a vision for advancing geoscience by John Eichelberger. Governor Dunleavy will then join us to provide live remarks. Next, we'll hear about the Rural Alaska Experience, Innovation versus Emerging Tech, from Katie Conway with the Denali Commission, Brian Hirsch from Deerstone Consulting, Taniqua Hay from the Department of Energy, and Dave Messier from the Tanana Chiefs Conference. We'll conclude our workshop series with presentations and a panel discussion regarding grid-forming inverters in the real world. Mari Shirazi with ACEP will moderate the conversation, and she will be joined by Brad Rockwell with Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, Julia Matavaisen, oh my goodness, my apologies, with Energy Systems Integration Group, and Ulrich Muenez with Siemens. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry if I mispronounced any of those names. Now, let's kick off today's event with an activity. We like to start off our workshops with some polls for the group. Yesterday, we asked the group, what is your overall sentiment towards AI technology? Is it optimistic, skeptical, or neutral? The responses were evenly mixed between optimistic and skeptical, with about 10% stating that they were neutral. To participate in today's polls, from your computer, please go to pollev.com/TOTTAK216. We recommend using Google Chrome for the best results. The link to the poll is also in the chat. To participate by phone, text TOTTAK 216 to the number 22333. You will receive a text message once you've joined the session. Type and send your response, and the results will pop up on the next screen. So, moving on to the poll for today. Can we please have the poll question pop up? So for today, we'd like to ask, how do you perceive the role of AI in shaping our energy future? Is it a game changer for efficiency and sustainability? Is it a potential risk to traditional energy systems? Or are we uncertain on its impact? We'll give a few moments for people to submit some of their answers. And while we wait for some of those responses to come in, some of you may find it interesting that we actually asked AI to help us write our question prompts for this workshop. Okay, we're seeing there's a number of you that believe it's going to be a game changer. I'd be curious to know, if you don't mind popping into the chat, whether you attended our session yesterday and heard about some of the opportunities on AI there, and if you had perhaps changed any of your opinions as a result of some of those conversations. I would find that interesting. All right, looks like about 45% that they think it's a game changer. A few of you, that just popped up to about 30% think it's a potential risk, and another 25% are uncertain. Thank you so much for participating. Now, we'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and the organization you're from. If you're having any difficulties with audio or trouble viewing the presentation, please send a chat message to Event Support for assistance. During the workshop, all attendees will be muted. Please submit any questions you may have in the chat. Our moderators will collect and curate those questions to be used during the Q&A portion of each section. The recording of this workshop will be available on the ACEP website at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com at a later date. Please continue to check back for more information. We're glad you're here with us live today. Now, to start us off today, please help me welcome John Eichelberger to present on Krafla Magma Testbed, a vision for advancing geoscience. As a reminder, please put any questions in the webinar chat, and we will get to those during the Q&A portion. Good morning, John. Thank you so much for joining us. Could you please take a moment to introduce yourself and your role here at ACEP before you get started?
Yes, thank you, Brittany. Well, I've been here, it seems like forever, variously as professor in geology and volcanology and dean of the graduate school, and I'm still around and transform myself into more of a geothermal energy guy. So I'm anxious to talk about that. So I will begin then. I'll share screen, and here we go. And then we go to presentation mode. Okay, are we okay?
Looks good.
Good. Okay, so that's me. And if you have questions or want to follow up, and there's my email. I'll respond. And yeah. Anyway, so let's get started. I've got two things to try to sell you on, and perhaps I should add a bridge as well, but I won't. One, and it's a dangerous thing to do to have two points, but they are intimately related, and one pertains to the world and our CO2 situation, and the other pertains to Alaska, a pressing need for energy in South Central Alaska, but it also has a CO2 element. Now, if I only present one of these, the Alaska people will say, well, what does this have to do with Alaska? And if I only present the Alaska part, some people will say, yeah, but there's a whole world out there. We got big problems. Well, so what about geothermal? That's what this is about. It's the only truly green baseload source, but it's under-researched and underused. It accounts for less than 1% of electricity production globally. And my argument is we should be doing everything we can to develop it. Can everybody see the right side of the show here? I see. That's my problem. Okay. You can think of geothermal as I can also think of okay. You can think of geothermal as a temperature spectrum from, kind of bath water. Well, 100 Celsius is more than bath water, to molten rock, 900,000 Celsius. You can do the math. That's a lot. That's approaching 2,000 Fahrenheit. And you'll notice I've kind of schematically here shown okay, here's a cursor. I've schematically here shown that, as it gets hotter, you have more and more energy in your source. But then something wild happens when you start to have molten material, and you see how it goes up. It goes way up. So this is the mother lode here, and that is magma energy. And that's what we need to get after. And then, okay, there we go. Well, why is geothermal so good? Well, it's the smallest footprint of any energy source. No mines, no haul roads, trains, reservoirs, pipelines. The biggest footprint is actually hydroelectric, because you see these nice lakes, but those were once nice valleys with bears and salmon in the streams and so on. So it has its disadvantages. Geothermal has zero or very low carbon dioxide emission. And that, of course, is incredibly important. And also incredibly important is it's 100% base load. It runs all the time. Even hydroelectric, there are droughts and things in California and China. But geothermal is going all the time. You can always count on it, just like a fossil fuel plant or a nuclear plant. And what that does is it reduces the amount of balancing act you have to do with batteries and all kinds of stuff that require critical minerals and are going to distort what areas we dig up on planet Earth. Well, there are some negative issues, as you might guess. There's a high initial investment, and that's for drilling. So you have to be really brave to jump in here. And along with that, there's uncertain production. With a reservoir, you know how much water is going to be there, so you know how much power you can get out of it. Not so before you drill with geothermal. It's also inefficient because you have to take what you can get as far as steam. And what you get is less in temperature and pressure in conventional geothermal than you do with the other ways of generating electricity with steam, burning coal, burning natural gas, burning oil, or burning nuclear fuel. So you've got only about a third of the conversion efficiency. You're cooling the reservoir, so you have to keep drilling makeup wells. and there's a limited geographic distribution. Well, that's kind of a fake complaint because everything has limited geographic distribution, even human beings. Well, bringing it home to Alaska, Alaskans know that if you take a bucket of water outside when it's minus 40, unfortunately, our friends in Anchorage don't often have that experience, but we do in Fairbanks. It doesn't freeze instantly. In fact, it takes 100 times, you have to suck out 100 times as much energy to freeze water as to cool it by 1 degree Celsius. That's called the latent heat of crystallization. It's like magic, and magma has it too. So water and magma are an incredible way to store heat in the earth. You may have seen this magma body. It's El Capitan in Yosemite. It's 1 kilometer on a side. A kilometer, if you recall, is 0.6 of a mile. So it's a lot of stuff. It's 1 billion cubic meters. And just freezing it like that bucket of water will give you a gigawatt of thermal energy for 30 years. So that's pretty big. Well, some people roll their eyes about magma, esoteric, and what does it have with us? Well, it has everything to do with us. It's why we have our noses above water. It built our continents, it built the ocean basins, and so on. The first stage in the development of the Earth was an iron magma that sunk down and made the core, which protects us with a magnetic field. But the other part is still going on. It's silica-rich magma, which is light and is continuing to form our crust. In fact, it's forming our ocean crust at a rate of about 20 cubic kilometers per year. That amounts to 100,000 terawatt hours, as compared to what humans consume of electrical power is 200 terawatt hours. So not saying you can get all that energy, but it's a huge number. So why haven't we tried this before? Well, we did. We did this 40 to 50 years ago at a lava lake in Kilauea volcano in Hawaii. It was an exceptional lava lake, 130 meters, about 400 feet deep. It stayed partly, it took 30 years to freeze, and in the interim, it was drilled many times to see how a magma body would behave. Well, it's not a real magma body because it's much smaller, and it's magma that erupted and then collected as lava, and it cools from the bottom as well as the top, but it's the closest we could get to magma at the time. And the purpose was to show whether or not it's feasible to extract energy from magma, and the conclusion was a big yes. And here's some things. One is, you can see these are temperature profiles at various years drilled into the lava lake, and you see the temperature gets up to over 1100 Celsius. But notice the temperature this is in a convective hydrothermal system. It's only at about the boiling point. Then you hit this thing that we'll call the magma lid. And nobody really knew about this before, but there the temperature, because it's entirely conductive, jumps way up, and now you're in the soup. We also showed, and I say we, I'm kind of the last man standing here, I guess, but, and sadly there weren't many women involved back then. Things have gotten better. We showed that you could drill molten rock, which sounds weird, but what happens is you drill with water or mud if you're from Texas, and it chills the molten rock to glass, and glass drills wonderfully well. And then we did energy extraction experiments and determined that you could get 10 times the amount of energy out of a magma well as represented by a lava lake well than you could from conventional geothermal. And that has proved to be true. Well, the next step, obviously, was to find real magma underground that hadn't erupted. And that proved very hard to do. We just didn't have the technology or the understanding to use geophysics to find magma. Besides, it was scary. You couldn't send off a proposal to drill into magma. People would really question your intelligence. Now they still do, but there's a good basis for this now because our geothermal friends, engineers, started hitting magma by accident. This was a huge surprise, much shallower than anybody expected. And I'll explain why it wasn't expected, but this was incredible. This brought up rocks that we have never seen before. Orange here is melt. These fish here are crystals swimming in the melt, caught frozen in place. This is magma frozen in place or quenched, we would say, at 2 kilometers depth, a little over a mile, and about 900 degrees Celsius. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. We were seeing what magma looks like in the subsurface. Not only that, but these wells, like the famous one in Krafla caldera in Iceland in 2009, in a 9-month test, it was cranking out more than 100 megawatts thermal continuously. In fact, it was even increasing with time. So, and the wellhead temperature got up to almost 500 Celsius, which is a record, needless to say. Well, this forced a big change in our view of magma hydrothermal systems. We knew that these hot hydrothermal systems had to be related to magma somehow, and that these were kind of stacked convecting systems. You got water circulating in permeable rock up here. That's your conventional geothermal system. And down here, you've got magma convecting. And in this cartoon, you see a separation of about 3 kilometers. But in fact, we find from Krafla that the separation was less than 30 meters. So a factor of 100, wrong, wrong, wrong. Now, this thickness is very important as far as thinking about energy from magma. For one thing, if you're up in the convective system, like you're in measuring temperature with depth in a teapot, you could project that temperature down, and you see you don't get up to high temperature. Here, you're at 5 kilometers. You're only gotten up to 400 Celsius. But what people didn't know, should have from Kilauea Iki, is that there's a conductive lid on the system, very thin, and in that conductive lid, because conduction is slow compared to convection, there's a very steep temperature gradient, and you get into the soup very quickly. So the importance of that thickness of that lid is huge because the amount of heat going from the magma to the hydrothermal system or geothermal system is inversely proportional to that thickness. I used to tell my students to think about the magma cabin. They appreciated that because lots of Fairbanks students live in dry cabins. And if you double the thickness of the wall of the magma cabin, you will reduce the heat loss by conduction by half. But we want it to be big. We want it to be big. We want to get that heat. Also, equally important, the response time of magma to energy extraction from the geothermal system is proportional to the square of the thickness of the lid. So you double the thickness of the lid, and the time it takes for the magma to get the news that you're sucking energy out of the hydrothermal system will take 4 times longer. But with such a thin lid, the magma gets the news right away. And what does that do? It causes it to convect faster because the convection is driven by pulling the heat out of the top, which makes the magma denser, and it's replaced by, in other words, it's flowing up and bringing its heat to you and say, here, take it. Well, just to put this in cartoon form, here is conventional geothermal. Almost all the heat is stored in the rock. You need to circulate a fluid to get it out, but the heat is stored in the rock, which is a lousy way to store heat because rock has a very low heat capacity. It's also not a good conductor. And you've got to you've got to conduct it from the hot rock into the fluid you're circulating. So this is a slow process. You rely on either natural permeability down here to get the fluid to flow through the hot rock, or you got to make the permeability hydraulically fracturing the rock, which unfortunately produces earthquakes and things like that. But look at a magma reservoir. You have extremely high heat capacity because of latent heat of crystallization. It convects, so it's bringing more heat towards you. And what people didn't realize was that it's thermally self-fracturing. This is a different kind of fracture. When you cool something down, it contracts and it's under extension and it breaks. So it's always opening up, as you take the heat out, it's always opening up new pathways, and it doesn't make earthquakes that way. So it's wonderful. So what have we learned so far? All the pieces we need. We can drill molten rock by chilling it to glass. We can control the magma with standard geothermal techniques. Nobody had any accidents in the sense of wells getting out of control, which is quite common in normal geothermal stuff, but you control the magma by cooling it, and it won't come up and get you. We can expect at least a factor of 10 greater electricity production per well. And remember that the big cost factor is drilling. So basically you can get 10 times the product for maybe twice the cost. And that proximity to magma, which we didn't know about before, is very important for sustainability because the magma will continue to bring the heat to us without drilling. But we need to be able to find magma reliably. We need to solve well-defined chemical and drilling engineering problems, but this is not rocket science, and it's certainly not fusion science. We've been putting billions and billions into fusion power as the magic bullet for half a century, and we still don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But this can be done, getting energy out of magma, and it can be done on a time frame that will help our carbon dioxide situation and our Anchorage friends as well. Well, why hasn't this happened before? And I will ask this question over and over again. Why haven't we done this before? How did we ever get to the moon? I don't know, because people can think of a million reasons not to do something. Well, one thing is our own fault, and that is that volcanologists and geothermal engineers never talk to each other. They go to different meetings. They speak almost a different language. They draw different cartoons, except geothermal engineers actually drill, and they actually know what's down there. And I'm sorry, my fellow volcanologists, but it's fantasy what we're saying is down there. Other obstacles, I don't think it's really sunk in what these accidental encounters with magma. We talked ourselves in because we couldn't find it with geophysics that there's not much magma down there. Well, if you can't see it a mile beneath your feet, then there's probably a lot more than you think. We thought, okay, the rock is ductile near the magma, so you can't have open fluid pathways. You can't get that circulation. But what we forgot about is thermal fracturing, which goes ahead on its own. Well, basically, we have to learn by drilling. That's the ultimate answer. We have to try things. We have to try different filaments in the light bulb. That's the only way we see the light. Now, we've done this for a century and a half with oil and gas. We need to do it with geothermal. We need to be more aggressive about this. And so there are really two ways forward. There's the grand public sector way that I am embarrassed to say I've been pushing working on this for a decade now. About Sisyphus, who was condemned to rolling a boulder up a mountain, and then he'd get close to the top and it would roll back down. Well, I feel like that sometimes. But we've got a host of top scientists and engineers from leading countries involved in this, and I think we'll get there. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's the way to get to a greener global energy mix, a international magma laboratory, and also with greatly improved forecasting of eruptions. And 10% of humanity, almost a billion people, live within the danger zone of active volcanoes. So that's very important. Now, the other is mostly private enterprise, and we're very lucky to have brave souls here in Alaska. Alaskans are known for bold exploration. We've got this kind of energy right on our doorstep with the Augustine Geothermal Project. And this is really low-hanging fruit. It's state land. It's desolate. There's not going to be environmental damage. Geo Alaska, based in Anchorage, with its partner, which is a big partner, Ignis, is exploring and developing this resource. And this summer, they've already done some encouraging geophysical exploration. This summer, they'll do more and hopefully slant core holes. Slanting core holes underneath volcanoes is one of my favorite things. And to find out what's there. And it's probably got everything from conventional. It probably has that whole spectrum all the way to magma. Well, again, you can say, why hasn't this been done before? It's so obvious. Well, of course, people were worried about the eruption hazard, but it's very well monitored now by the Alaska Volcano Observatory. So not to worry, and you can mitigate the hazard by where you put your power plant and so on. So, and the Icelanders show us that you don't worry about eruption. They build the power plant at Krafla while the thing was having a big eruption. Not to worry. People were concerned about submarine transmission of electricity, but this is a mature technology now. Look at all the offshore wind farms sprouting up. Obviously, there's an extension cord from those to the shore. And people would say, oh, don't worry about it. There's plenty of oil and gas in Cook Inlet. Well, guess what? Looks like we're running out. And the other huge step is it's not been drilled. And somebody has to be brave enough to be first. And fortunately, we have those people. Well, since it hadn't been drilled, I put together the profiles of other volcanoes that are very much like Augustine that have been drilled, and just to show what the temperatures ought to be like. And you can see we ought to be up to 250 Celsius at only about a kilometer below sea level. Well, that's good conventional hydrothermal. But there's likely a super hot plume coming up from magma, and we have both geochemical and geophysical evidence of magma at only about 4 kilometers depth. So we probably have the whole spectrum here: conventional, super hot, and magma. So take your pick or take it in stages. It's fantastic opportunity. Now, the other approach, and I feel a sense of urgency about this. Carbon dioxide is going up. We're not getting so many minus 40 days. What a shame. And I'm not going to be here forever. I want to see some progress. Well, so we need an international magma laboratory or observatory. And that's clearly the best places in Iceland. At Krafla volcano, where we know exactly where the magma is, and we can retrace the steps of these accidental encounters because people drilled into it unexpectedly, so they weren't prepared to make any measurements or anything. They just got out of there before they got stuck. So the purpose of this test bed will be to test how best to find magma, how magma is stored in the crust and drives geothermal systems, and to experiment with the best way to extract energy from magma. And you can see these are the active volcanoes in the world. Okay, they're not in the middle of Kansas, I'm sorry, but they're not that far away. So what remains to be done? We just need to put this all together. We got to solve these well-defined chemical and mechanical engineering problems in the extreme volcanic environment. We've done it for jet engines. We can do it for magma. You just have to try. We need to ground truth our geophysical techniques. Apologies to my geophysical friends. I have to spread the blame all around, but we've never done that. We have no tests of this except the ones that show us that we're wrong, that there's magma that we didn't see. So we've got to drill and learn. And we're running out of time, as I said. And it's ironic. So 50 years ago, at the start of my career, we were vigorously going after alternatives to fossil fuels because we didn't have enough fossil fuels. Now we're, I would say, not so bravely, but still kind of going after, because we think we have too much. use of fossil fuels. So the first phase of this big international observatory, which is it's analogous to a particle collider that the physicists use or a space telescope. One country doesn't do it by themselves. They do it together. We'll have an observation well where we track temperature and pressure continuously with time across the solid rock to magma boundary. Nobody has done that. Nobody's done anything close to that. And then we'll drill another hole to experiment with how best to get energy out of the magma. And we'll use this observation well as a listening post to interpret the kind of signals we're getting. Our big problem is that and this comes back to betting big, we've got to bet big, and we're at the wrong poker table. The stakes aren't nearly high enough to solve the problem. This goes on fine in other fields. The astronomers do it, the particle physicists do it, the planetary scientists do it, but the geoscientists can't do it. And I would argue that planet Earth is the most important planet in the solar system. Now, we learn a lot from looking at the other planets, but we happen to live here. So that's the message. Betting big is the key. We can bet big locally, and it's being done by GeoAlaska and Ignis and their investors. And I truly believe this will likely make a big contribution to our current energy problem in South Central Alaska. And then on the global scale, we really need a global effort on this because there's magma spread all over the world. And so we just need to get together. We're close. We've established a nonprofit organization in Iceland. We've got a lot of countries interested. US is dragging behind a little bit. I don't know how we ever got to the moon, but I know, because the Russians were going to the moon. If only the Russians were trying to drill for magma, then we'd be in there. And they had a plan to do it about 40 years ago, but then the country fell apart. So that's the message. It's under-researched, underused resource, and the mother lode is at the hot end, and we've got to go there. Thank you for your attention.
John, thank you so much for sharing. This is interesting. I liked your comment earlier how you said that if you submitted a proposal to drag into magma, that people would question your intelligence. So you talked a lot about betting big and what we need to do here in Alaska. You also made a lot of similarities along the lines of we did it for oil and gas. So as we're searching for magma, when we're looking at maps, is it very similar to some of the terrain and features and stuff that you're looking for oil and gas when you're looking at subsurface maps? Or do we have the technology and what we need to do some of that exploring and drilling that you're talking about?
Well, we certainly have a lot of, there's been a lot of drilling of hydrothermal systems. So we have a lot to go on. You don't go to the same places as oil and gas have been drilled because high temperature breaks down hydrocarbons. You go to where the volcanoes are, and a nice thing about this is you go to where there already have been drilled hot geothermal systems, and you just drill a little bit deeper now that we know what these systems are like. So in a perfect world, you don't expand the footprint at all. And I should say that there is a lot of private sector interest as well, and not just with Augustine, but with lots of other places. And it's hard to put the private and public sector worlds together, but it's not impossible. So there's a lot of interest out there. It's got to happen. It's just a few brave people being willing to be first.
Gotcha. And just for the audience sake, please feel free, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. We did get a note from the governor's office that he is going to be running a few minutes behind. So we do have a few extra minutes to take some questions here. So in regards to drilling, you talked a lot about, you talked some about drilling into mud and it turning into glass and all that. So going back to that point of we need to drill, is that a skill set and a workforce that we already have as it relates to drilling into magma, or is there different skills and techniques that we need to ensure that we have in order to make that drilling aspect successful based on the geoscience and terrains in those areas?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good question. The geothermal people, particularly in Iceland and Kenya in the East African Rift, have quite a bit of experience with this. Also, but as I mentioned, geothermal is pretty small scale. It's tiny compared to oil and gas. But there are a lot of people in oil and gas who see the handwriting on the wall and are migrating into geothermal, hoping to apply their expertise to geothermal. So there's been a big effort on both I think it's the Society of Petroleum Engineers and the Geothermal Research Council, now called Geothermal Rising, which to get these people together. So there is a migration of talent into geothermal world, which is very encouraging. But ultimately, it's going to take actual drilling, not just thinking about it, to solve this problem, and that takes money.
So when we're talking about the energy transitions, one of the reasons that geothermal is of interest is that it can provide a firm baseload source of power. So when we're talking about a lot of other sources, there's a lot of variability. How do we integrate it? We're going to have a talk later on this afternoon that talks a bit more about grid forming inverters in order to address some of those issues and concerns and challenges and opportunities. But geothermal, that's one of the interesting points that could make it a successful source if we can tap into it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, there's not going to be one silver bullet. It's going to be a mix of things, but the more we can have baseload power, the easier it's going to be to transition. And I think a reasonable goal for geothermal, and if we go after magma in a serious way, would be like 10% of electricity production, which people care about every single percent. 10, if we could displace 10% of fossil fuel production, of electricity, that would be huge. And it could be more. What was I was going to say? I was going to make some incredibly profound comment, but it's flown away now. Yeah, we've got to go after the real mother lode here, the high temperature end of the spectrum. In fact, interesting thing is that while we're busy ruminating about energy sources, the demand is going to be increasing. And one of the drivers here, which you alluded to in your poll, is artificial intelligence. Those rely on data centers that are just energy hogs. So the projection is that by the end of this decade, they're going to be sucking up 10% of electrical capacity, and it's just going to go up from there. So it's not just that we need to replace fossil fuel use now. We need to generate more electricity too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'll ask a final question here since I'm not seeing any others come into the chat. You've noted several times the importance of coming together as an industry or as a broad research group. How can we, what do you hope to see to help make that happen? You noted some efforts that have started already, but in your perfect world, if you could wave a wand, what does that partnership and collaboration look like?
Well, with Craft, we're trying to design that now, and I'm not a businessman. I'm not an economist. I'm working with some who are kind enough to give advice, and I'm sure other people are too. It's not easy. I think that once that first hole into magma gets drilled, the first intentional hole, not accidental one, that will bring a lot of, we'll get a snowball effect, which is the wrong end of the temperature spectrum, but we'll see a big shift toward interest in this. Right now, we're all in the Craft Magma testbed team doing everything we can with science plans and business plans and meetings and so on and so forth. One thing I didn't really understand as a professor was the difference, I should have, between the academic world and the corporate world. In the academic world, you just put everything you know out there for free. You may even have to pay to publish it. And you hope that your institution recognizes how wonderful you are and so on. In the corporate world, knowledge is money. It's worth something. So you don't just blab it out there. It's intellectual property. And putting those two worlds together, because both have their strengths, is a tricky thing. It's going to take some lawyers. Good job for lawyers.
So I know I just told you I was going to ask you a last question. In the meantime, we have had more come into the chat, so I'm going to merge two together. Our first question was, what are some key safety measures to drill into magma? And then to build on that, Paul Craig, CEO of GeoAlaska, says a frequent question he gets asked is, are you going to cause an eruption if you drill into magma at Augustine Island? Please explain why this is not a risk. So can you talk a little bit more about drilling into magma and some of the safety and risk considerations and how it is not going to result in an eruption?
Yeah, well, basically, the control is similar as with hydrothermal systems, except that um, it's more a matter of temperature control. The viscosity of magma, which is its ability to flow, skyrockets up as you cool it down. It goes up by a factor of 10 for every 100 degrees. So, and we've seen this happen at Krafla, where magma started to come up the hole and people just circulated water and it stopped it. It's like oil and gas. You just have to prevent it from boiling down there. Triggering an eruption, well, those seem, this is like poking an elephant with a pin, which I would not want to do, but that's the kind of the size scale thing. It's, yeah, that question always comes up. And again, we're cooling magma down. Actually, by extracting energy, we're making it less likely to erupt, not more likely. One could even dream that you could stop volcanoes from erupting by sucking out enough energy from the magma. I'm not the only one who's mentioned that, and but I don't want to be seen as too crazy. We made a lot of progress about this not being crazy. It's a natural question that people are going to ask, but what we're doing is the opposite of what would cause an eruption. By taking energy out, we are reducing the likelihood of an eruption.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful information for people to understand. Another question that came in is in regards to the nonprofit in Iceland. Is Iceland the lead, or is there another country's research team that's taking the lead, and what other countries are involved?
Okay, good question. We just had a meeting at the University of Munich with over 200 mostly scientists. It was fortunately a few Americans there, myself included, but I would like to see more since I came up with this idea of a magma test bed. And now my own country doesn't seem terribly interested, but we're making progress. In fact, the energy secretary was just there, and with the Iceland Ministry of Energy picked Krafla as a place for collaboration. The other countries that are very interested are the UK, and they were on the verge of funding it when COVID came along, and Brexit, but they're very interested. Germany, Italy, perhaps France. Yeah, Iceland. Well, it's on Iceland, so they need to play a leadership role, but it's a tiny country. It has 1,000th the population of the United States. It's about the population of the greater Anchorage area. And so they've put in or promised about $2 million so far. That's like $6 from every individual in the United States. That would be 2 billion. So we'd be there.
Awesome.
So yeah, there's a lot of interest, and I think we'll get there.
Awesome. And with that, we're going to have to end our conversation with you, John. Thank you so much for your presentation this morning. We do have the governor with us this morning. So thank you so much, Governor Dunleavy, for being willing to join us to provide some live remarks. Governor Dunleavy is very passionate about energy issues for Alaska and is the primary architect behind the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. Governor, thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's funny that I'm sitting down with you right now because 5 minutes ago, I was with the Senate leadership, and the discussion was the energy bills. They're trying to get as many of our energy bills passed as possible. The impetus or the origins, the genesis of a lot of these energy bills, because as a result of discussing energy with groups such as yours and experts such as you have. And so I want to thank you for everything you're doing. Your work is certainly moving Alaska forward. The question is, how fast can we do it? And that's really part of the discussion down here. So I think what you're going to see come out of this legislative session are a number of energy bills, energy-related bills as well. Everything from carbon sequestration to upgrading the utility grid, green bank, a number of issues on net metering. So Alaska is, as they would say, an all-in state. And these energy bills reflect that. And again, a lot of the bills reflect the work that many of you are doing as well. We went to, my staff and I went down to San Jose to a NVIDIA conference. And we were fortunate enough that I had met one of the former VPs of that company. And we were able to get plugged in. We had a front row seat to when the CEO of the company, Jensen, was talking about what the future looks like. And there is no doubt it's an electrical world the future is going to be. The question is, how are we going to generate the electricity and how quickly we can do it? Because I think it wasn't too long after that Altman came out and was talking about AI and kind of reaffirmed what was being discussed at the conference. And that was, without electricity, we're not going to be able to have the advancements, the positive advancements in AI. I know there's some that are fearful of it, but we won't be able to have positive advancements because right now, they estimate if they were able to be able to meet the needs of the demands that we have right now worldwide, we need 3 times the electricity we have right at this moment. And so the ability to produce large amounts of electricity as quickly as possible and transmit it and distribute it is going to be key. One of the other things that they talked about, which was enlightening for me, and I think if you look at some professional journals or articles since that meeting in March, is a number of these supercomputer outfits associated with AI and server farms. Many of them are thinking about how they themselves can generate electricity because they understand that the competing with, for example, legacy residential type of utility setups is going to be direct competition with residents, which is going to drive up the costs. And we see some of that happening now in places like Virginia. And we're seeing some of the pushback and the blowback in places like Virginia. And so a lot of these outfits that are doing the supercomputers and are doing the servers recognize that problem. And so I think what you're going to see in the future, again, it's based upon a lot of the discussions that you're having is, we're going to have, I think we're going to have an increase to our transmission capabilities. We certainly are going to have to also be discussing our distribution capabilities, certainly our generation capabilities, everything from gas we're talking about right now. We did a new siting bill here a year or so ago. We're looking at sequestration possibilities that may be able to allow us to do some fossil fuel-based generation as long as that's sequestered. There's a whole host of things happening. And Alaska, with its tremendous resources, but at the same time, its challenges, I think it's a great laboratory for the work that you're doing. Large landscape, great resources, top of the world, which poses problems for things like storage over a 12-hour period of time. I mean, we have a whole different setup, obviously, than Hawaii does. And so you have the challenges of storage, you have the challenges of scale, you have the challenges of transmission, distribution. But I think these are all challenges that we can meet and overcome. And I think as a result of that, I think Alaska will continue to be a leader in this innovation across the world, because what happens in Alaska certainly can have an impact at the same latitude around the world, latitudes, both in the northern and southern hemisphere. and also in remote parts of the world, whether it's Africa or parts of Asia. And so I'm just excited about the advancement in the technologies. I'm excited about the advancement in storage. It seems like every day you wake up, there's a new possibility or new confirmation on storage, generation, distribution, transmission. And so I just want to let you know that your work is key to the future of this civilization. I'm not overstating that. But everything you do, including the work that folks are doing on AI, and AI in and of itself is estimated to shortly soon be able to help us understand and solve some of these generation, transmission, and storage issues. So I think it's an exciting world. I think it's an exciting future. I think the work that you guys are doing is going to be the basis by which our civilization leaps forward in a positive way. So I just want to leave it with those thoughts. Wish you nothing but the best. Look forward to seeing some of you at or as many as possible at our conference in May. Again, your work is appreciated. Your work, in many respects, is incorporated into the bills we'll be doing. And by the way, we'll be doing a number of bills next year, a number of bills the year after that, because we are somewhat behind in Alaska. But your work is a central part of that. So with that, I want to thank you. Have a great conference. Great work.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Really appreciate your comments there. So that moves us into our next panel, where I'm going to be joined by Katie Conway with Denali Commission, Brian Hirsch with Deerstone Consulting, Taniqua Hay with the Department of Energy, and Dave Messier. And we're going to be talking about the Rural Alaska Experience, Innovation in Emerging Tech. Please continue to drop those questions in the chat, and we'd love to integrate them into our conversation. So thank you, everyone, for joining me this morning. And let's start with some introductions. Katie, if you don't mind, can you start us off by taking a quick moment to tell us about yourself and the Denali Commission?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. So I'm the Energy and Bulk Fuel Program Manager at the Denali Commission. And for those of you from outside of Alaska or other places unfamiliar with the Commission, we're a very small independent federal agency with a mission to support critical utilities, infrastructure, and economic development in all of Alaska's far-flung rural communities. The energy program is, it's been pretty big over the 25-year history of the Commission, investing very heavily in foundational energy and bulk fuel infrastructure like rural powerhouses and tank farms. However, there's also been a lot of work over these 25 years in helping to make these small powerhouses ready for renewable integration and kind of supporting some of the ancillary initiatives that ultimately lead to better long-term management of facilities and even a little bit of workforce training. My background, I've been at the Commission for about 2.5 years. Before that, I spent about 10 years at the Alaska Energy Authority, and in between AEA and the Commission, I spent a few years at a local engineering firm doing public involvement. I'm from Alaska and proud of it. I love Alaska. Was born and raised in the Valley, and now I'm raising my 2 kids here. And I'm sure there's probably more to say, but I don't want to hog all the airtime here. And I know Dave and Brian and Taniqua have a lot also.
All right, thank you. Brian, moving over to you. Can you tell us briefly about yourself and the work you do with Deerstone Consulting?
Sure. Good morning. Brian Hirsch with Deerstone Consulting, founder, CEO. We've been around for, I think it's 9 years now. And we work really across rural Alaska and elsewhere, but our prime focus is in rural Alaska with tribes, cities, borough governments, as well as lots of other, who's ever out there, native corporations, helping to try to lower costs, improve energy reliability and security, training local people, trying to really bring jobs and the benefits that some of the federal funding, for example, has really been providing as opportunities, really trying to turn that into jobs and skills and improve quality of life for rural residents. Prior to that, I worked with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which was part of the U.S. Department of Energy, and did that for most of the Obama administration's time. And prior to that, really worked all over rural Alaska in consulting private and public sector organizations, nonprofits, et cetera. So have been doing this for quite some time. And currently, especially with some of the funding, and I know the DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations here, we got Tanika Hay on, and we've been very fortunate and engaged in some of their funding opportunities and have helped to bring in, over $250 million to Alaska in the last 6 months or so. Not all of that is OCED, but a lot of that has been through their auspices, and that's not directly to us, it's on behalf of our clients. And so we really are driven by the people who live out there and need assistance. So thanks for the opportunity here.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. Tanika, can you also take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your role at the Department of Energy there?
Sure. Hi, my name is Tanika Hay, and within the Department of Energy, I work in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OCED, in their engagement office. And OCED's mission is to deliver clean energy demonstration projects at scale and in partnership with the private sector to accelerate deployment, market adoption, and equitable transition, which that just simply means we'll invest in clean energy projects that support quality job creation, that advance environmental justice, and which facilitate an inclusive energy transition in all communities. And also those that ensure that benefits flow to disadvantaged communities. So as some of you are aware, that office was established about 2 years ago by the bipartisan infrastructure law to scale clean energy technologies. So we received about $25 billion for demonstration projects. And $1 billion of that funding was allocated to the Energy Improvements in Rural or Remote Areas program, which is the program I work most closely with. And so that program, ERA program, is designed to address distinct energy challenges to communities of fewer than 2,000 people. So ERA aims to fund community-driven energy projects that demonstrate new energy systems that deliver benefits to customers and build clean energy knowledge and capacity throughout rural America. So this program is just really meant to support rural and remote communities, like many of those in Alaska, that face these unique challenges of geographic isolation and disproportionately high energy costs. I've been at DOE for the last 8 months. Prior to that, 10 years prior, for the 10 years preceding that, I was at International Finance Corporation, which is the World Bank's private sector arm, and their Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Office, advancing similar opportunities in rural communities, but around the world.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dave, could you take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about Tanana Chiefs Conference?
Sure. Thanks so much. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm in a shared office space. There might be some background noise, but we'll try to keep that down. So my name is Dave Messier. I am the Infrastructure Division Director for Tanana Chiefs Conference. We are an intertribal consortia located in the interior of Alaska, based in Fairbanks. And we serve about an area the size of Texas, fewer miles of road in the state of Rhode Island. And that includes 37 federally recognized tribes. So that's about 6% of the federally recognized tribes nationally. The vast majority of those tribes are not part of the Alaska Rail Belt. They are remote microgrids. And for the last 12 years at Tanana Chiefs Conference, and then for roughly the last 15 years, my job has been focused on trying to reduce energy costs out in our small villages and trying to incorporate technology that reduces village diesel consumption. So I'm currently the Infrastructure Division Director. We've got energy, which is kind of my passion and what I've been doing for the last 15 years, also broadband and housing. To date, we've received about $176 million to Tanana Chiefs Conference through different infrastructure funds, predominantly the federal government, but we act at TCC basically to deepen the bench of some of our tribes. We work with a lot of smaller tribes. Sometimes populations in our communities are smaller than 100 people. And so Tanana Chiefs Conference was developed as really kind of an intertribal consortia to assist with economic development in our communities and tribal governance. And we've since moved into the health space, and we're an Indian Health Service contractor. But at our core, we still try to strengthen our tribal government. So that's what we've been doing in the energy program. And I would say we maybe pioneered kind of the sort of large solar PV diesel battery systems that are coming more commonplace in the region. We put in the first large system in Hughes, started in 2017 and brought it online in 2021. We just commissioned another one in Manly, or I shouldn't say it's fully commissioned yet. That'll hopefully happen the next week. And we are working with about 12 to 13 different funded projects to try to make that kind of the standard across our region. So that's kind of my role at Tanana Chiefs Conference. And then putting on a different hat, I also have the great privilege of serving as a cooperative board of director for my local electric cooperative, Golden Valley Electric Association, where I serve as the treasurer. Been a board member on that board for about the last 6 years. And I also have a small consulting business, Daylight Energy Services, and I've been heavily involved with some of the other small diesel solar battery systems in Shungnak and Noatak that have come online, and also the Cosby Solar Project. And then with partners supplied battery energy storage systems to Stebbins and recently to Shack-Tulik under contracts with AVEC. So lots of history working in rural Alaska, and I would say it's kind of my passion.
Great, and it shows. Thank you. Katie, you wanted to add some comments there.
Yeah, I feel like I flew over the commission's energy portfolio pretty fast, and I just wanted to add a little bit of context before we start diving into this conversation about innovation and emerging technology and kind of what the roles of the two are together and the interplay. The Denali Commission has invested very big in rural Alaska energy infrastructure over 25 years. I think it's probably hard to find a place in rural Alaska that hasn't been touched in some way by one of the Denali Commission's projects or initiatives, whether it's a full-on piece of infrastructure that you can touch and feel. Maybe it's the powerhouse, or it's a wind turbine, or maybe it's their local powerhouse operator has participated in a training that was partially funded by the Denali Commission. I think we are working with Tanana Chiefs Conference and Deerstone, and kind of peripherally, even with OCED, by gap funding some of the projects that have recently come out of that very large and exciting announcement. I think there's probably a lot I should add, but I just wanted to say we have a lot of different types of projects. The bread and butter of our energy program has been investing very heavily in rural power system upgrades and bulk fuel tank farm upgrades, but we've also helped utilities and communities, tribes develop renewable projects. Back in the day, I think the Denali Commission was one of the initial funders of the now kind of, it's not active anymore, the Emerging Energy Technology Fund. And we're kind of play a unique role in being able to easily adapt to changes and needs and trying to fill the niche that nobody else is filling, like gap funding, particularly right now with all of this exciting federal money coming down from the IRA and BIL, like the recent OCED awards. Being able to help meet some of that non-federal match requirement is one of the things that we do kind of alongside those bread and butter diesel programs.
Well, and I would argue the unique flavor of the Denali Commission funding support makes these projects happen. Without that funding, a lot of these projects would be really challenged in providing any of those match funds. So to kick us off a little bit deeper into our topic here. So Katie, I first reached out to you because you are actually developing an entire rural track for the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. And as we talk about innovation and emerging tech, we had an initial call where we really, you made the point very bluntly that emerging tech is not always appropriate for rural Alaska, and that innovation can mean something different. So can you expand on that point there, and how do you see the role of each one in regards to rural Alaska?
Okay, so I don't want to necessarily be a killjoy. Emerging technology is really exciting, and there are some great new initiatives throughout Alaska right now. But I think that what's important is that we don't want to overemphasize just looking at that long-term horizon at the next new shiny, blingy technology. Sometimes it kind of feels like everyone believes in a magic bullet and everyone thinks that it's a different type of thing that might be that magic bullet. And if we invest too big in those types of solutions, maybe we lose sight of the acute needs that rural Alaskans face right now with having reliable, safe, and affordable power and heat for their communities. I think innovation can be emerging tech, but it doesn't have to be. And sometimes innovation being the thing that's probably been very important to rural Alaska forever, being a thing that means you have to rely on creating unique, creative solutions to the problems at hand, just using what's readily available. Sometimes innovation can be the less fun, less exciting, less sexy thing, but it can make a big difference. And one of my favorite examples of how innovation has played out in rural Alaska is heat recovery. I think based on what I've heard talking with folks, that is something that might have started at AEA a long time ago, back in the Chris Noonan days. And now it's kind of the default practice to put these, and Brian can go into the technical specs if you want to go into the technical details of it, but essentially being innovative, saying, hey, we're generating power. It's a byproduct of that powerhouse. That diesel generated power is a lot of heat. Can't we use that? Isn't that another resource? And so putting a different piece of equipment, the marine jacket around the engine and piping in order to put relatively lower cost heat into proximal buildings. And so that default practice has been very useful for rural Alaska. And now the next thing we probably need to innovate is answering questions like, well, what happens when you integrate so much renewable, like solar, perhaps, that those diesel gensets aren't producing as much heat, but you don't want them to get cold. You don't want the piping to get cold. And so what kind of solutions are available using the resources and the knowledge we already have at hand so that we can solve the problem today, instead of looking at decades down the line at emerging technology solutions that aren't realistically applicable for right now.
Brian, Katie kind of kicked the ball your direction as Deerstone works with Alaska's rural and tribal communities. From your perspective, what is the difference between innovation and emerging tech, and how should they be considered for rural Alaska?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Katie was saying. From my standpoint, I think even just from almost like a strict definitional perspective, emerging tech is not in the here and now, right? It's something that shows promise. We have huge needs, both in the immediate moment and into the future, right? I mean, the governor talked about some of that as an example. So large scale geothermal or hydrogen or what have you is something that would be great, but we're years from things like that. And in some ways, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a distraction. We need to put some time, money, resources, focus, and attention on those kinds of moonshot type issues, but they're not solving immediate problems, and they run the risk of distracting our attention and resources from what is currently urgent needs. And so the emerging technology are these sorts of things that are, maybe 5 or 10 years away. And for example, hydrogen is a great technology. For the 25 to 30 years that I've been in this field, hydrogen has been 5 to 10 years away from being commercially viable. And that goalpost keeps getting moved out, right? And so my guess is that I'm going to be older and grayer and maybe out of the picture by the time hydrogen really comes into the fold, but I wholeheartedly support it as something we absolutely need to put some effort into. Whereas innovation is the kind of situation where we have something that's operating right now and we need to improve it. And there are unique situations and demands that are maybe specific to either an individual community, which is really hard because you can't justify a lot of investment in time and effort if it's only going to benefit one place. But rural Alaska writ large, I think we can certainly justify and see the progression of things. And so, for example, on one of these OCED grants that we just now received, and we, in this case, I'm talking about is the Northwest Arctic Borough in the northwest part of Alaska, that has a lot of players, Nano Regional Corporation, Kotzebue Electric, and Alaska Village Electric Cooperative are some of the other stakeholders in the mix here. And one of the projects that was funded by OCED was to, and the governor talked briefly about it just a few moments ago, was to develop a medium voltage direct current transmission line or power line that connects two villages. And so we have interties, we have power lines that connect villages together right now, but the cost is such that with the current technology, we're limited to about roughly 10 to 12 to 15 miles between villages before that no longer makes economic sense. And so the two villages of Shungnak and Kobuk, which are involved in some of the solar projects, et cetera, that Dave mentioned, and we've worked on collectively in kind of different roles, they are 10 miles apart. And they are both part of Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, AVEC, and they have a failing transmission line right now, in part because of climate change. The poles are falling over, the permafrost is melting, and it's just old infrastructure. Instead of just going in and replacing that and not having any kind of innovation or anything benefit other than just kind of getting it back to where it was status quo, what we're doing is applying a new technology that is not, it's taking electric vehicle charging technology and which allows switching between alternating current on the main grid to direct current in batteries. And we're using that technology in a new application so that you can develop this power line. And if and when this works, which we're quite confident it will, then it will allow us to extend the economic distance between two communities. And so if we get this to work properly, then the thought is that we can extend to maybe 20 to 30 miles between villages, and or to a longer distance where maybe there's a wind resource. So you can now use medium voltage direct current transmission to go from the wind source to the community. So it's something that exists. It's proven technology. It's applied really all over the world in terms of electric vehicle technology and power line distribution systems. And we are now applying it in a new situation that has tremendous short-term opportunities that will allow a lot of communities to be interconnected and reduce the amount of powerhouses we need, to reduce the amount of bulk fuel resource or demand spread out across villages. We can maybe focus in places where there's better resources, easier access to get to fuel distribution, et cetera. So it has a huge promise. And really, without OCED support, we just would not have been able to use this new application. So that's an example, I think, of innovation that is in the here and now that really has tremendous potential benefit. And the emerging technology is something that we are just kind of looking out over the horizon and seeing something that we need, but not ready to apply it in the challenging conditions of rural, remote Alaska.
Great. That was quite comprehensive from both Katie and Brian. Dave, or even Taniqua, did either of you have comments that you would like to expand on between innovation versus emerging tech in rural communities? Dave, I see you unmuted first.
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit and then let Taniqua hop on with her feedback. I guess I've been doing different what you'd call energy innovation in our communities for many years, and I think Brian and Katie reflected on it well. Folks like to sell rural Alaska as a really great test bed for technologies. What we've seen at TCC and through my various hats over the years is that it is not the most ideal place to be testing quote unquote new technology or something with a lower commercial technological readiness level. Things are just more expensive to tinker with and to adjust in rural Alaska. And so we want to be innovating as opposed to putting in emerging technology, because innovation, and I'll use our experience in the battery world, right? I think globally there was something upwards of 500 gigawatt hours of lithium ion energy storage installed across the world last year. So in our area in rural Alaska, right, where Brian, I, and Katie all work, I would say there's less than 2 megawatt hours installed. So the technology is well thought out, well vetted, and it's there. It's just not really there for our application, but we see the need. So our job as innovators is to take that technology, which is really robust, well thought out, well designed, and working in many, many areas across the globe, and kind of use it in the use case that we all see and know well, and try to get the number of megawatt hours into the gigawatt hour range, if that's practical, or at least, more megawatt hours installed out there, because that's what's going to drive down the cost of, producing electricity for some of our powerhouses. So that's another kind of significant difference, is making sure we're using technology that's already, it's past the appropriate technological readiness level phase, and we're just using it in a slightly different application. And that's kind of the big difference that I see.
Thank you. Taniqua, did you want to add anything from your perspective there?
Or I know some of our earlier discussion was on around what OSED is looking for in these applications, and relative to our most recent announcement. But ultimately, we're seeking applications that leverages a region's natural resources, local industry, stakeholders, the climate and economic risks. A lot of these factors are critical towards the ultimate replicability of these projects that are in rural and remote areas. And to Katie's point, these may not always be the sexiest, but last week we were pleased to announce that of the 19 projects that we selected in our most recent grant, 6 of those came from Alaska. And it's a variety of different technologies, but a lot of really tried and true, like in Ambler, there's a high penetration solar battery project, and Studio Hawk, there's another solar battery project. So there's a lot of battery systems that you'll see across that portfolio. But these are things that are needed and easy to replicate and get up and running. So, I mean, for us overall, they're going to support diverse and replicable clean energy technologies, right? They're going to improve access and energy resilience. Lowering the energy burden is a big piece, especially for us in Alaska, and continuing to develop the rural and remote workforce along the way. So that is kind of where we're focused.
Thank you so much. We've had 2 comments in the chat that are kind of formulated into questions here, and they're making the point of advanced emerging tech by maybe some other types of technology that may be more well-known. Dave, I think you touched on it a little bit in regards to your example with batteries, for instance. So the first question asks about the potential for microreactors in rural Alaska, and how can we address advanced technologies for those? And the other comment is talking about the role of wind and solar and how they're kind of falling in the gap. They're not necessarily emerging tech anymore. There's a lot of deployment actually in rural Alaska. So can we talk a little bit more about some of those technologies that may not be emerging, they're a little bit more tested and proven, but how they apply into some of these remote regions may still have their own challenges? Who would like to take that on first? It's kind of a 2-parter there.
I can. I'm sure a lot of people have comments on those. I think that's maybe a very good example of the difference between innovation and emerging tech, because I think the microreactors are emerging tech sort of at best, as in they are both far afield they're not in the here and now. They don't exist other than in nuclear submarines, basically. And so I think that in general, that technology has a ways to go, both in terms of reliability and cost and proving itself. And if anything, the track record of nuclear power is nothing but cost overruns and unfulfilled promises. And so for rural Alaska, I think microreactors, especially villages, are really, quite frankly, if not an empty promise, something that is mostly a distraction at this stage and is probably a decade or more away. And so if a community wants to focus on that, they ought to have a plan B, which is innovating and improving their current situations. And so wind and solar are things that exist right now. I was involved in 1998, I believe it was, or 99, installing one of the first community scale at the time considered solar PV projects in Alaska. It was north of the Arctic Circle in Arctic Village. And, now it would be considered almost a joke. It was a couple kilowatts, right? But it was at the time, it integrated with the diesel power plant. We were saving fuel nominally. We were able to demonstrate some fuel savings, basically, but it was very small scale. And at this point, what we're doing with solar is integrating it with batteries, which is where the trick is, and really turning diesel generators off. And that is the innovation. Just 5+ years ago, there were some scientists from one of the national labs that was attending one of our meetings up in Alaska, and we were talking about diesels off. And they literally said, "What do you mean diesels off?" And we said, "You turn the diesel generators off and you keep the village running." And they were like, "What do you mean? That doesn't exist." And so that's now become commonplace. And it's a matter of, well, how far can we get with batteries and solar and wind? Can we get to 50% fuel displacement, and not just with electricity, but with space heating? And so those edges of pushing outward are where we're at with wind and solar at the moment. And that is in the here and now. And so those are the kinds of innovations that I think are, really worth a lot of support and a lot of focus and attention. And that's the difference. I'll just leave it at that.
And I can kind of piggyback on that. I very much agree with Brian's sentiments. And there is a project here in the Fairbanks North Star Borough we're all very excited about. One of the first small nuclear reactors that's going to be done by the Department of Defense and a contractor on Eielson Air Force Base. That project has had some delays, partially related to contracting, but even with that first in the nation project to produce electricity, I believe they're looking at upwards of 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which that's fine. And we all would love to see more time and effort and development put into that emerging technology. But to Brian's point, it's, the energy challenges that rural Alaska is facing are here and now. And so we, in my opinion, need to be focused on technologies that are here and now. So Ben's point in the chat about, solar kind of falling into the cracks. I think that a lot of the integration challenges that Brian mentioned are ways that we can fill those gaps. But even, something as mundane as looking at the foundation systems that solar arrays use to stand upright and to not move around with our melting soils and very diverse geotechnical considerations. So innovation in regards to how we're mounting solar arrays and the integration of the powerhouse. And those are all areas that we have a lot of room for growth in. And that's all technology that it's off the shelf now. We just need to figure out how to fit that into our environment. And I always like to mention kind of what brings it home to me and the difference between emerging technology and innovation. When I first came up to Alaska in 2009, there were some folks at a prior organization that were moving forward with a hydrokinetic project on the Yukon River. That was a project that we spent many years on and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Didn't end up producing a ton of electricity on that. And my example is always, we spent 3-4 years on that technology, $400,000 or $500,000 at least, a lot of time and effort. And that next year I put up a solar array down in Nenana and produced more electricity in the first month of that solar array than we had in the previous 3 years of that emerging technology on the Yukon River. And so, when it comes to trying to address the problems that are facing our villages here and now, they're really important considerations to just figure out where you spend your time and effort on.
Great, thank you so much. Earlier in part of her introduction, Tanika used the term geo-isolated. And I think when we think about rural Alaska, that is very true in many cases. And with that come challenges of transportation, access to fuel sources to support energy generation. So as we consider Alaska's energy future, especially in rural Alaska, what are some other ways that we can be creative with the resources that we have in order to support our Alaska communities? Kicking it off to whoever wants to start. Katie is unmuted first.
I think that I'll probably end up kind of pitching this to either Dave or Brian, but two things come to mind. When we talk about innovative solutions to solving the problems at hand today, it's not just the type of technology that we're using. Sometimes it's financial solutions or kind of administrative structures or governance. And two things that I'm thinking about right now are the trend toward helping tribes or communities become independent power producers as a workaround for some other things. And then also, Dave, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because you recently told me about essentially it's a bridge loan that TCC is using to kind of solve some of the cash flow problems with reimbursable grants. And I think, again, it might not be the most exciting thing, but these are really effective, practical solutions that solve the problems we have right now. And I think that's worth mentioning. And one other thing that has been coming to mind as we talk about this and reading through the comments, innovation and emerging tech, I think we have to think about the goals that we're working toward. It's not just the problems we're solving, but what's the ultimate goal? Is it reducing cost? Is it reliability, safety? Is it moving away from fossil fuels? What is the thing driving the decisions we make? And I think that prioritization of goals might have an influence on the type of solution selected.
And I can just kind of
Yeah.
jump in and piggyback on some of Katie's comments. I think in general, something that if you've been working in rural Alaska for a lot of years, you've probably seen kind of people come in with the latest, greatest solution and just kind of curious as to, geez, why isn't this being implemented in rural Alaska? And there's a lot of nuance to working in rural Alaska, understanding who owns the utility, what are the different drivers at the community level that motivate them around lower energy costs. And having an awareness and a knowledge of that will really help guide you to the right solution. So for my organization, for Tanana Chiefs Conference, I think it really helps us because we are a consortia of different tribes. So we're not an outside entity that's coming in looking at this problem anew. We're kind of steeped in the last 60 years or so of the challenges of trying to do economic development, just tribal sovereignty, all of those different challenging pieces of rural Alaska. And so we know and we represent obviously the tribes that we work with, and that gives us a slightly different perspective. So to Katie's point about some of the unique things that a tribal entity like TCC or an entity that represents our communities and knows some of the challenges very well about life in rural Alaska can bring to the table. It is the bridge loan product, if you will, that Katie mentioned. So you guys, I'm sure all on the phone are aware of some of the direct pay tax incentives that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are phenomenal and they 100% cut down some of the barriers to tribes, cooperatives, nonprofit entities accessing the tax credits and being able to build out more solar, more renewable energy. The challenge is if you don't have the best financial structure in place or the right financial structure in place, you're not able to take advantage of some of those direct pay incentives. So Tanana Chiefs conferences kind of come in and our model that we've worked with our tribes on, and it's an evolving model, is to own the systems so that TCC can go after funds under the direction of our tribes to build out systems. And then if TCC owns them, we are able to claim the tax credit from the US Treasury under the direct pay provisions. And so we've got a revolving loan that was set up internally at Tanana Chiefs Conference, which provides some of the capital to put those projects into place. And then after the project is placed into service, my organization goes through and collects the tax incentives from the US Treasury and kind of recycles that money into the revolving loan fund that we've got set up. And then we can move on to the next project. So in doing that, we're able to bring the cost share for a lot of the federal grants and really help our tribes take advantage of some of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that previously they may not have had access to. That does come with a stipulation that TCC, as the recipient of the tax credits, has to own the systems for at least 5 years. And we're still working through that with some of our tribes. Some of them are not supportive of that. Others are very supportive of that because they recognize that there's not the knowledge to maintain the batteries and sometimes even the solar systems in their communities. And so kind of aggregating a variety of different systems under one roof, we're able to support long-term operations and maintenance on those systems And our goal is just to spend taxpayer dollars as wisely as possible and accomplish the goal of reducing energy costs in our villages. And this is, it's not a perfect solution, but it's one that we believe will work and the best available that we've got right now.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that innovative approach on financing. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we have a question from the chat that I think works really well with one of the points that we wanted to get across. So I'm going to set the context with kind of what we talked about, but also weave in this question from the audience. So one of the points, or at least considerations, is what it means to be the test bed. And an important factor for communities is community determination, that they have information where they can make their own informed decision making. So as we look at various funding opportunities to help move these projects forward, Taniqua in particular, you require a community benefits plan with OCED proposals. But a lot of those funding opportunities are very prescriptive. How do we apply those nuances to the real world? And then in the chat, we have the question, what is the process for a community to advocate for and obtain existing green tech if they are interested? Where or to whom do they go to for resources, especially if they don't have representation like TCC or access to significant funds? I know that's a very broad question. In general, we're talking about how do we apply funding opportunities to the nuances that we see on the ground, and how do we help and make sure that we have community determination in the projects that are moving forward. Taniqua.
So I can start with kind of just a little bit on the process coming into creating these funding opportunities, especially I can speak specifically to this rural or remote provision. OCED conducted listening sessions and workshops to hear from state, local, and tribal governments, utilities, private sector project developers, and other rural and remote communities on the different various energy challenges and the types of projects that can improve their respective energy systems as part of us developing this FOA. And so this one was actually not that prescriptive as a result of that, because we wanted communities to be able to implement what made sense for them. And so there's a variety across the portfolio of projects and applications. You'll see a variety of different technologies. And even with the process, like this last announcement, the grant application even streamlined the application in response to a lot of the feedback about just the how the level of effort, especially for smaller communities, to be able to apply for these funding opportunities. So that I may have missed another part of your question, but just in response to being prescriptive and the process of hearing from communities, I think the other piece is, all of these applications required a community benefits plan. And so that was just to help reduce risk by engaging public support early and throughout. And that's, the prime applicant and those prime applicants working with the partners that they're engaging as well. And so those are required, and they're based on a set of 4 priorities: that's engaging communities and labor. We want to ensure that people are impacted, have a role, investing in America's workforce, and advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and implementing the Justice 40 initiative. And that's just to ensure that project benefits minimize harms, and that benefits are going to communities that need them.
Thank you so much, Taniqua. Katie, I saw you come off mute.
To answer the question that I'm seeing in the chat, and I'm sorry, Brittany, that you asked a longer, more involved question, but I think I'm going to just address that one. There is no one single place to go for that type of assistance, how to advocate for existing green tech, but there are a lot of resources out there, and a few that might be worth mentioning. If it's a tribe that's interested in exploring different renewable energies, you might want to start with the Office of Clean Energy, or sorry, with the Office of Indian Energy's Technical Assistance Program. That's been very effective in helping develop the right next project. You can, if you want to see what work might have been done to explore options in the past, maybe looking through AEA's project, their library online, which I believe now catalogs all of the existing work. So maybe there's been a feasibility study at some point in time. It might be worth knowing that, so you can rule out things that have already been proven not feasible. There are, I mean, you can send me an email, and once I have a better sense of where you're located and what your goals are, I can point you in a direction maybe. And I think it's safe to say another resource is the Arctic Energy Office's Energy Ambassador Program. The ambassadors, there's one in each region, are kind of being if they're not already in the role of serving as kind of a liaison for communities, they are learning that they're being connected with the entirety of the Department of Energy's resources through the labs and other offices. So those are just a few. And I know that Brian's mic is off, so I think he might want to have something here too.
Yes, Brian.
Just real briefly, I would actually echo a fair bit of what Taniqua was saying, and just maybe add a little bit of a perspective from somebody who's involved in a lot of the federal funding opportunities. I think OSED in particular has been very sensitive to the realities of challenges with federal grants. On one hand, it's understandable you want to have a relatively high bar because you want to know that if you're putting public money into something, that it's going to turn into a real project. So that results in some relatively demanding, or just, lots of detailed questions and maybe some engineering questions, things like that, where you have to have a little bit of have a good idea of what you're actually going to do. But what OSED has done, at least from my perspective, is really tier the differences between a very large scale grant that's complicated, multi-communities, et cetera, and cost share requirements, as compared to a single community and a little bit more straightforward of a grant and a process where there's no cost share requirements. And so there's still a reasonable hurdle that is necessary to, again, ensure that there's a quality project that's being proposed. But the most recent announcements that were made for the rural communities efforts were much more focused, much more streamlined, and it's still a challenge to communities, I think. And that is a hurdle that we all try to address, whether it's with finding funding to help put grant applications together, and or providing coaching, or whatever we can do, teeing up some of the feasibility studies and things like that Katie was just mentioning. But in the end, the reality is that federal grants are a challenge, and you need some technical expertise to successfully compete in that situation. You need an organization that is attractive to a federal funding agency, of which somebody like TCC is a perfect example of that. So that's part of the ingredients for success. And Denali Commission, similarly, I think, has really done a very effective job and just tried really hard to meet communities where they are and have their applications be a due diligence investigation on one hand, and yet a relatively easy hurdle to pass for communities that are struggling for some of those resources to just get in the game and get their paperwork in place. So, I guess kudos to both DOE, OSED, and Denali Commission for that, but it is a continual hurdle, and it's ongoing. It's not sort of a simple equation for how to do it. So I'll just leave it at that.
Dave, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just throw out there for just for posterity or what have you, that Brian and Katie all kind of described this unique aspect of being accountable and also lowering the barriers to entry. And just as a baseline fact, right, it is generally complicated to produce reliable, low-cost electricity. That's a fact, and to distribute it around a community. And so we always try to encourage communities that are interested in projects. As we like to say, TCC is there to deepen the bench. but we just want communities to go into any project with eyes very much wide open as to the future responsibility that they're taking on with any of these projects, and just to start with the end in mind and figure out, well, what are the known maintenance items? What's the track record with maintenance? And how can we put in a project and design it from the get-go so that we minimize the risk of future issues? Because at the end of the day, everybody wants these projects to be installed cost effectively and to succeed long term. And if we can do both those things, then we have a win, but they're not easy things to do.
So Taniqua did put some resources in the chat for those that are interested there with the DOE and EPA. Also, I want to do a shout out to, and much to what TCC is doing for some of their tribes, the Alaska Municipal League has really been trying to deepen local government benches as well. And I think they've been doing a phenomenal job of trying to work and provide that support there. So that could be another location to go. We are at time, but I would like to go around the room and offer each panelist to provide any closing comments and regarding this theme with the audience as we go. So Dave, you're at the top of my screen. Why don't I start with you?
Sounds good. Well, thank you guys for for holding this conversation. And I just would strengthen that anything we can do to kind of collaborate as more of these projects hit the street, if you will, and get developed. It's still, that innovation aspect is still kind of emerging, and we're all trying to figure things out through the lens of what's going to have the best chance of long-term success. And again, keep long-term maintenance costs as low as possible. And so I think the more of these conversations we have, the more collaboration we can do kind of as a state and look at things holistically. That's probably the better for everybody, especially our rural communities. So thank you guys for hosting the conversation.
Thank you. Katie, I've got you next.
I just wanted to say, like Brittany said, there is an entire lineup at the Sustainable Energy Conference dedicated to the challenges and success stories and lessons learned on all things energy in rural Alaska. So I hope to see you there. That lineup of 6 sessions is intended to kind of set the table for a deeper dive into some of the more technical aspects of rural energy at the Rural Energy Conference in Fairbanks this October. And I hope that you will consider joining us there as well. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you, Katie. Taniqua, any final comments?
Katie, look forward to seeing some of you at the sustainability event. But also, one last thing is just really wanting to publicly highlight the work of some of these different programs. I think Alaska has a lot of public support from elected officials, and that does a lot to continue to promote a lot of this work so that we can continue to get additional funding for this work so that we can continue to fund the great projects that are out there just waiting on funds. So I just encourage to continue to share those stories, continue to share feedback, because as I mentioned before, we really do take that in and take it into consideration when we're designing future funding opportunities.
Thank you. And Brian, last word.
I just say thanks for the opportunity to share here. And, I think we are in a very unique moment in history, and with some things aligned. And I hope that we can take advantage of this in a way that really brings benefits to the places where we're talking about, as in rural Alaska and energy burden communities really across the country. And, it's welcome support, and it's on us to really steward those public resources and investments as best we can. And so discussions like this, I think, help advance some of that. And, collaboration, partnership, transparency are all just really important, and will continue to serve us well if we can keep those at the forefront. So thanks a lot.
Thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your flexibility on the timing. That does move us into our break. We are running a few minutes behind. So we were going to start our next panel at 10:30. We would like to have a 5-minute break right now. So we hope to see you all here in 5 minutes, and we'll be talking about grid forming inverters in the real world. Thank you so much for everyone. We'll see you soon. Welcome back. Thanks again for joining us today. To continue on with our program, please help me welcome Mari Shirazi from ACEP to moderate our next panel, Grid Forming Inverters in the Real World. Mari, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Please take a moment to introduce yourself and your panelists, and the floor is yours.
All right, so our panel is Grid Forming Inverters in the Real World, as you can see there. And so I am a research professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks at Alaska Center for Energy and Power. My background is mostly power electronics, but I think in this world that we're moving into, the fields of power electronics and power systems are beginning to merge, and there's a lot of intersections there. So I'm actually super excited about our panelists today. Grid forming inverters, it's a hot topic these days. We've been hearing a lot about the technology and its benefits, and a lot of it has been based on modeling. So there's many people are really wanting to know what's the real world experience, from real world deployments, what are entities around the world doing right now to ensure, develop in terms of interconnection requirements, to ensure that they can exploit the benefits of this technology while maintaining, high reliability of their systems. So we have 3 panelists today. So first we have Julia Matavoisian. Julia is the chief engineer at the Energy Systems Integration Group. Julia has more than 20 years of experience in the power industry with a primary focus on reliability impacts from transmission connected inverter-based resources. Julia will discuss the ongoing national and international applications and interconnection requirements related to grid forming inverters. And Julia will speak first, and next we will have Brad Rockwell. Brad is the Chief of Operations for the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, and Brad has been instrumental in helping the island of Kauai go from less than 10% renewable energy to over 60% in 10 years. Brad will be discussing Kauai Island's experience with grid forming inverters. And then finally, we will have Ulrich Munz. Ulrich is the principal research scientist at Siemens, Technology, with more than 15 years of experience at the intersection of power systems, power electronics, and automatic control. Ulrich will discuss control interactions and stability of inverter-dominated power systems from microgrids to transmission systems. So I'm excited about everybody here because these are the people who are among those who have the most experience, anywhere, who have the most experience with real world applications, requirements, developments, and benefits, as well as challenges of integrating grid forming inverters into power systems. And I'm also excited because this is, it's a relatively small, Alaska-based group. I want this to be an opportunity for Alaskans to hear from and access these experts. And I want this to be I'm hoping this can be an open dialogue. I'm really hoping people ask a lot of questions, and that includes voicing concerns. There may not be definitive answers to every question, as consensus is still building, for some questions. But I believe these folks can share the most up-to-date and the most informed thinking today. So please ask questions. We will start with Julia.
Right. Thank you, Mari. Thanks for the introductions. And thanks everyone for being here, listening to our session. I'll first try to set the scene about grid forming technology overall, why we're looking at it, why is it needed. And then I have a couple of real life examples, and then I think Brad has much more actual experience to show, as well as Ulrich. So I think it's a good order of presentations. So I'll start from kind of very beginning. We started with strong grids with high 0% of inverter-based resources, and I'll use inverter-based resources all the time in my presentation. And what I mean by that is power electronic interface, wind, solar, and battery storage. And so as we started getting about maybe a few percent of this, we didn't really think about what kind of features we need from these resources to provide, and we would just connect them to the grid and they generate megawatt. And then over time, as we started getting into 10 to 20% of inverter-based resources, we started thinking, oh, now we need some grid-friendly features. So we don't want them to trip offline if disturbance happens on the grid, and we want them at least to hang on and stay and generate power. As we started getting into 20 to 50%, then we started asking for more features from inverter-based resources, maybe provide some frequency support and voltage support. Now, as we're getting into, in some of the systems, at least we're getting into 50 and 75% of inverter-based resources. And so now, unless we change even more what inverters can do, then to ensure stability of the grid, we need to keep conventional synchronous generators online to provide some of the essential reliability services that the system needs. Or we need to install additional transmission equipment that can provide stability to inverter-based resources that we keep adding to the system. And so in the absence of inverter-based resources with advanced controls, which we now termed as grid forming, there is a limit on how much renewable energy can be installed. And so basically we're stopping at the 75 to 80%, and we cannot move any further. But on the other hand, keeping conventional generation online to provide stability, it leads to higher renewable curtailment, and also adding transmission equipment to provide stability to inverter-based resources is expensive and time-consuming. So what is grid forming? I pulled this definition from NERC. I think people still kind of working on definitions, and multiple definitions exist, but just this one to set the scene. Grid forming inverter-based resource controls maintain internal voltage phasor constant or needed constant in subtransient and transient time frame after a disturbance happens on the grid. And this allows inverter-based resource to immediately respond to changes in the system and maintain inverter-based resource control stability during changing system conditions. So basically it responds nearly instantaneously to any changes on the grid during disturbance events. The voltage phasor must be controlled to maintain synchronism with other devices on the grid, and also regulate active and reactive power appropriately to support the grid. There are many variations of grid forming and grid following controls, but we must notice that they both are subject to physical equipment limitations, and this includes voltage and current and energy limits. And also in wind turbines, there are additional mechanical equipment constraints that must be taken into account. Also, expectation is, as we are installing grid forming inverters on the grid, that they conform with all other requirements that currently apply to conventional grid following inverter-based resources. So some of the potential uses of grid forming controls, what are they kind of good for? This is operation and providing stability in weak grid conditions, providing damping of voltage and frequency oscillations, response to phase jump. So it's like voltage angle, phase change that they can respond to. They can support and limit initial rate of change of frequency, so provide sort of similar response as inertial response from synchronous generators. They can inject fast fault current and support the system during subsynchronous control interactions, and in some cases, if designed to do so, provide black start capability. So coming back to this kind of high-level cartoony figure that I had before, if we have grid forming inverters on the grid, we can potentially get all the way to 100% inverter-based resource grid. And that would be possible to achieve stable operation of such grid. I would like to add, you can install grid forming as a transmission asset, for example, so it doesn't have to be on the resource side, but grid forming capabilities from inverter-based resources, and specifically on battery storage, are cheaper and faster than adding these new transmission assets. And also installing new transmission assets, this is like an additional investment that is required from the grid side, whereas if you're installing a battery anyway for for operating on the grid and, charging and discharging. Then in addition, it can have grid forming controls and therefore provide this additional benefits. So there is a slew of requirements that have been developed recently in the past 5 years for grid forming specifications around the world. I will not read through that, but it's just to say that, it started in Europe and Hawaii, where they started looking at new advanced capabilities of inverters that are needed. And so now requirements also exist in Great Britain, Australia, Germany, and recently in Finland. And recently NERC also published a white paper with grid forming specifications. There are different flavors of this grid forming specifications. They can be higher level or more detailed. They can be functional specifications in terms of what's required from inverter-based resource, or specification can be formulated as a set of tests that apply to inverter-based resource model in the simulation where they can demonstrate grid forming behavior. Oftentimes, requirements from grid forming resources are split into core and advanced capabilities. And sometimes they're not split, but what I mean by core capabilities is where no additional equipment or oversizing is required or additional storage is not required to provide this core grid forming capabilities. Whereas advanced capabilities is where inverters may need to be oversized, or maybe you need additional storage just to provide grid forming functionalities. And another one is black start capability. For example, it requires additional consideration. So these type of capabilities are considered as advanced capabilities. And then requirements can be voluntary or mandatory, and they either define for all inverter-based resources or just for batteries, which is more prevailing if you look at all requirements that exist today. I also divided in this table on the left-hand side requirements into ones that published by system operators or regulatory bodies. So these are more type of requirements that are binding. They may be not mandatory, but they are deployed to some kind of market mechanisms. I'll talk about that just in a minute. There are requirements that are published by research organizations because this is relatively new field, and so research organizations are also taking proactive steps about describing functionalities that we're looking for from grid forming. So some of them are published, some of them in a draft form, and some of them just being planned. And a couple of those to mention is ERCOT, MISO, and Florida Power and Light are all working now on grid forming specifications in their areas. If you look at these requirements, you can think, there are so many and there's such a big range of these requirements from different countries. Are they all so different? And in details, maybe there are differences, but at the high level, in terms of functionalities that they are looking for, there are a lot of commonalities. So they are looking to nearly instantaneous response to voltage phase angle step, response to voltage magnitude step, response to change in megawatts on the grid. So if a large generator trips or large load trips, then they expect nearly instantaneous response, somewhat similar to what synchronous generators provide today. What happens when inverter-based resource hits current limit? What are the desired behavior at those operating conditions? Requirement to counter harmonics, counter imbalances, provide damping, operate in low system strengths, but also support stability in low system strengths conditions. Support islanded operations, so when a part of the grid separates from the mainland, and sustain this operation of the island grid without outage of loads. And also black start capabilities. I have it in a different color because, as I said, it's not required everywhere, and it requires specific design considerations. And you also wouldn't expect every inverter-based resource to be black start capable. So just to provide one example of ERCOT, they had recent notable disturbances in 2021 and 2022, where a large number of inverter-based resources with conventional controls disconnected for normally cleared fault conditions, and this indicates reliability risks. So ERCOT currently focuses on improvements of capabilities of inverter-based resources and its performance, but also on strengthening the grid. And they feel like both is needed to maintain reliable operation. So they're currently looking to adopt NERC reliability guidelines, to adopt IEEE 2800 standard, which is a new standard for inverter-based resources connected to transmission and subtransmission level, and also recommended synchronous condensers to strengthen the grid in this area in the West Texas. If you look at the interconnection queue, ERCOT has 17 gigawatt of batteries that already have financial commitments and signed interconnection agreements in the interconnection queue, and the entire queue for batteries 145 gigawatts of requests. So they are seeing that batteries may be a lower hanging fruit for grid forming implementation. They already have 6 gigawatts of batteries, which are all with grid following controls, but they also see that more is coming and are exploring now this benefit that grid forming batteries may bring to West Texas. So they conducted preliminary study to look at the benefits of grid forming there. And the study showed that while grid forming batteries cannot solve all of the issues that they have in this part of the grid, it can improve system dynamic response and support grid following inverter-based resources in this area. It's not plug and play solution. It still requires proper control settings of those grid forming resources and coordination during interconnection studies. So as a next step, they're currently working on developing grid forming requirements for batteries, and the requirements will be focused on performance modeling, studies, and verification. And they are planning to bring it to the stakeholder groups in July this year. So this is a list of all grid forming projects that have been built or nearly completed currently. So you see there are some pretty large projects there, and you see projects in Hawaii, in Australia, National Grid, ESO in Great Britain, in Germany. And I'll bring just 2 projects. These are not the newest ones, actually probably some of the oldest ones in that list. But I want to bring them because I think they're better described than others. And I thought it was a nice example. This specific one, Mackinac back-to-back voltage source converter HVDC, I think is interesting because it's in the US and it's been built long time ago at the time when grid forming term didn't even exist. So this is 200 megawatt bidirectional back-to-back HVDC converter station, was commissioned in 2014, and it was installed between upper and lower peninsula of Michigan Peninsula to support the upper peninsula grid. So that part of the grid is relatively weak, and they had some inverter-based resources connected there already. And so this back-to-back converter was supposed to support the grid on the upper peninsula. The voltage source converter technology was selected because it can provide better voltage control for the upper peninsula, provide stability in weak grid conditions, power oscillation damping, governor-like frequency response, so similar to synchronous generators, it can regulate frequency. It can support islanded operation and also has black start capability. So basically, if the upper peninsula grid goes black, it can serve as a black start unit to restart that grid. What is doing, like where does it get energy from, is from the lower peninsula. So basically, the lower peninsula in this case is acting as a battery, as an energy source to support the upper peninsula grid. And as I mentioned, the term grid forming didn't exist at the time, and it was interesting to find when I first found out about this project. I looked, and on the webpage, it didn't say grid forming, and it was called phasor voltage control. And then a few years later, when grid forming term appeared and ABB became Hitachi, actually grid forming term appeared on the webpage. And so this next project is Dalrymple grid forming battery energy storage in South Australia. It has virtual synchronous machine control method used to control that battery. This was first large-scale grid-forming battery in Australian transmission system, was commissioned in 2018. It is on the end of a long transmission line, and it's close to grid-following wind farm, which is 91 megawatt. And also supports local load and local rooftop solar. So basically, when this line disconnects from the rest of the grid, this part of the grid would go black and this load would be disconnected. Whereas now with grid-forming battery, it can support islanded operation of that part of the grid. And so basically, since they installed this battery, they could drastically reduce loss of supply for this area. So just to look at some functions that this battery is providing, it provides inertia type of functionality, so it can basically reduce rate of change of frequency after sudden loss of generation or load. It supports system strengths in the area. It can operate in very low system strength conditions, but can also support the grid in this weak grid area. Supports islanded operation, provides black start capability, and it also has it's being used as a part of remedial action scheme, which they call system integrity protection scheme, which provides fast active power injection when the grid is losing a significant portion of generation. So it responds basically in 250 milliseconds, providing type of fast frequency response. As I mentioned, there are various ways how grid forming is incentivized. In Great Britain, they had a series of tenders called Stability Pathfinder. And so in 2022, they awarded 5 grid forming batteries through that tender. But now the requirements that they have developed for grid forming will apply to these batteries. And then National Grid ESO followed up with development of stability market design, and this market kicked off at the end of 2023. In December 2022, Australian Renewable Energy Agency supported 8 grid forming projects with some percentage of investment that was matched by the agency. AEM also has Australian system operator also has a minimum system strength requirement, which you would expect it incentivized grid forming batteries, but the way the requirement is currently formulated, it doesn't actually value grid forming for provision of system strength. So that's something they're still working on. And trying to incentivize grid forming there. And in FinGrid, it was also very interesting, I think, situation is where they allow grid forming batteries to be built in weak grid areas where other type of resources would be rejected and would not be allowed to connect. And so basically, if you are grid forming, you are allowed to connect. If you are a grid following resource, you cannot connect in this part of the grid. And ERCOT actually proposed similar idea in the dynamic stability assessment in 2018, but it yet remains to be seen how they are going to incentivize grid forming batteries. So just to conclude, if inverter-based resources are built with grid forming controls, stability can be provided by resource itself. And so you don't need additional mitigation from the transmission side of things. And it also allows to increase share of inverter-based resources on the grid, potentially going all the way to 100%. Grid code requirements and market products are needed for grid forming inverter-based resources so that manufacturers know, what type of controls to produce. And how and developers know how they will be incentivized to install this capability. There have been a number of activities in the US and Europe, in Australia in the past 3 years to accelerate deployment of inverter-based resources. However, and I'm sure you'll hear it from Brad and Ulrich as well, there is much more work is needed. And we also need to quickly seize this window of opportunity where we have a lot of batteries sitting in the interconnection queue. And as I mentioned, for batteries, this is a lower hanging fruit for grid forming controls on a battery. And if we install all these batteries with grid following controls, going back and retrofitting will be much more complicated. And so with that, thank you so much. And I'm waiting for your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. I forgot to mention what we're doing is we'll do 15 to 20-minute presentations by each panelist, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A at the end. And just you can write your questions in the chat at any time. I'm keeping track, and I will ask them when we get to the end. So next up we have Brad.
Okay, thank you. You hearing me okay, Mari?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm Brad Rockwell, Chief of Operations for Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. So we are the electric utility, and we are a cooperative on the island of Kauai. Disclaimer, I'm a mechanical engineer, not electrical. So I'll just throw that out there. Next slide, please. Probably no surprise, but just in case, I find a lot of people aren't too familiar with their Hawaii geography. We are out in the middle of the ocean and fairly isolated, but even within the island chain, we are somewhat detached from some of the main islands of Oahu, Maui. So we're about 80 to 100 miles even from the island of Oahu, where most people in the state live in Honolulu. So we're up in the northwest corner there. Next slide, please. And the utility ownership in the state is there's basically two electric utilities. One very big one, relatively speaking. They serve 95% of the state and all islands except Kauai. And that is Hawaiian Electric Industries is the parent company. They have HECO, MECO, and HELCO. And then there is Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, us, up there in the upper left, purple. And you can see sort of the population and density customers per mile of line for each of the islands. Next slide, please. And we are unique in that we don't have the choices that many other grids have, in that there's really no large hydro, no coal anymore. There used to be some coal in the state, but all the coal has gone away, and there's actually a provision in the state constitution that you can't develop any new coal plants. Same as no nuclear fission is allowed in the state, and there is no natural gas currently. So pretty much where most of the continent gets the bulk of its power, we don't have those choices here. So historically, it's been small hydro, bagasse from the sugar plantation days, and then as more recently, a lot of oil. Next slide, please. And we do have 100% renewable energy law. We were the first state in the United States to enact something. It came after there were about 3 years they attempted to get this done, and finally passed in 2015 legislative session. And you can see there's some intermediate wickets there. So far, everyone did meet the 30% by 2020. Oahu was the lowest. They kind of barely got over the bar. They've got the most challenging situation with the most people and the least amount of open land to develop lots of renewables. But all the other islands were comfortably above that 30%. Okay, next slide, please. And specific to our utility, since we are a cooperative, like many in Alaska, this is probably somewhat familiar. Our governance comes from our board, who is elected by our ratepayers, and they have set an even more aggressive target of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2033, so 12 years ahead of state law. And you can see down in the bottom there, sort of our progress over roughly the last 12 years. All the way on the left, I don't even have my reading glasses on, so I don't know what year that is. I think it's 2010. We had a tiny bit of hydroelectricity. I think our renewable percentage was about 8%. And then we have slowly started adding some solar projects, you can see in the yellow. And then we did get a small biomass project developed. That's the green. And we just keep on adding more solar. And more recently, those solar projects have been coupled with battery systems as well. And so we believe we have a good path to get to 100% renewable by adding some more solar and battery projects and probably mixing in some biodiesel, which we just started consuming last year in many of our existing generating units that are able to use biodiesel. Next slide, please. This is just a little different representation of how things have changed in 10 years. And so you can see the breakdown also on the solar side between our customer owned solar behind the meter stuff and our utility scale solar. Next slide. And some quick statistics, just so you can kind of put things into context. Our peak is 80 megawatts. Oh, shoot. I have an alert that came up on my screen. A test that our IT system was doing. Did you guys see that too? No? Okay. Sorry about that. I got rid of it. We have 80 megawatt peak. We do have a 69 kV transmission system with multiple switch yards and multiple power plants. So I point this out to say I don't think of us like a microgrid. We have, from my understanding, all aspects of any other electric grid, large electric grid. We're just doing it on a smaller scale. Next slide, please. And this just goes to show, when you get a lot of renewables, it's going to take up a lot of many portions of the island. We used to just have, a couple of these dots here when we had a couple thermal power plants, and now we have large scale renewable projects all over the island. So there is that issue of land use and seeing more of the infrastructure throughout the island, which in a place like Kauai that kind of relies on tourism and its natural beauty can be sometimes sensitive. Next slide. All right, so our renewable advantages, we do have a low population density and lots of unused land available for renewables like solar and biomass. We used to be largely in sugar plantation business, but those have all shut down. So we have tens of thousands of acres of unused land that are available for that. We do have pretty good topography. Peaks on the island are over 5,000 feet. And of course, we go down to sea level. Historically, there's been some good state tax incentives. And of course, I'm sure folks are familiar with the current available federal incentives to be able to apply to such projects. And when you're competing against the cost of oil, typically these projects are saving our ratepayers money. We're not having to bring them on and ask people to pay more for them. Next slide. And we do have some challenges. A lot of people think that we have all the renewables here, geothermal, wind, sun, wave energy, all sorts of things. But what we've found is that we, being a small grid, we are challenged by economies of scale. We can't, just develop a gigawatt solar project at, 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So we have other challenges. And of course, we have to ship heavy batteries here and things like that. So our projects do come at a somewhat of a cost premium compared to other locations. We don't have any transmission interties. So, we're always having to balance our supply and demand. Our wind resources on the island of Kauai are not as good as the other islands, for example, the Big Island and Maui and even Oahu. And we are the oldest of the main Hawaiian islands, so we are far removed from the hotspot. There's no geothermal potential on the island of Kauai. So we see us doing a lot more solar. I think we've kind of developed all the available hydro on the island. We're not looking to do more biomass because at the scale we can do it, it's fairly expensive. So more solar mix in with some long duration storage. And that's kind of where we see us getting to 100% from where we sit today. Next slide. Okay, so our 100% renewable, which is not necessarily 100% IBRs, and I put 80 to 90% VRE, variable renewable energy. that variable renewable energy is solar, because we don't have really any wind. So that is all inverter-based generation as well. We first did this in 2019. That was after we converted one of our units to a synchronous condenser. So that was sort of the thing that we needed to get done before we were willing to operate the grid at 100% renewable and 80 to 90% inverter-based resources. And it was interesting because at some point, you theorize this and you model it. At some point, you got to actually do it. Say, open the breaker on that last generating unit and let's see how this thing works. And so we kind of did it on a Saturday morning for about 30 minutes until I said, okay, we've proven it, we can do it. And since then, we've just done it more and more. And now the regular operators on shift are just doing it all the time. And so it's very common. We'll do this almost every sunny day. And we've gone as long as 10 hours in any one day, and our batteries and inverter-based resources are controlling frequency and voltage. And we, have them to provide whatever fault current they can. But really, we have that synchronous condenser, which is our single largest generator on the island. It's a 49 MVA generator. So, on an 80 megawatt peak grid, it's a good amount of short circuit current that we have. And so that's the criteria. We have to have that synchronous condenser available for us to operate in this mode. And we're actually converting an older steam turbine to a synchronous condenser at our Port Island power plant within the next year or so. So we'll have a second synchronous condenser capability. It's a smaller unit. It's about a 12 MVA unit. But the neat thing about that project is that we're going to actually add a flywheel to it. So we're going to increase the inertia of that generator. So that, and we'll have less parasitic losses than the current synchronous condenser that we use. So we'll just run that one 24/7, 365, because we never use that unit for real power currently. But the unit that we're operating as a synchronous condenser now happens to be our most efficient thermal unit. So we want it online, delivering real power often. So in order to get this to 100% renewable, I talked about longer duration storage. From where I sit today, I see that as a tank of biodiesel. A tank of biodiesel was weeks to months of storage. Just to be clear, I don't see that we're going to be able to see any huge leaps and bounds in battery technology getting us to weeks or months of storage in the near future. So that's fine. The sun will come up pretty much every day. We'll run as much renewable and use as much of the sun as we can. And when we need the biodiesel, we'll operate the biodiesel. Next slide. Okay, this is difficult to read, I know, but just to orient you, this is from our Pi historian. It's a one-day snapshot. Looks like it was a little over a year ago. This is a day where, typical day where we ran 100% renewable and around, 90% inverter-based resources. So the red line in the middle is our system frequency. You can see before the sun comes up and after the sun goes down, our system frequency is fairly stable, but during the midday, it's all over the place. Probably, I think it's about 59.8 to 60.2 is what that range is. And that's being driven by those 3 shades of green lines. Those are 3 utility scale PV sites that have no battery storage whatsoever. And these are relatively big projects because the 2 of them are 12 megawatts each and one of them is 6 megawatts. So you total those up, 30 megawatts of unmitigated solar PV with no storage on a grid that's probably averaging 60 megawatts during the midday. So about 50% is coming from that. So they really move frequency around. Then we've got 2 shades of purple and 1 pink. Those are our 3 solar PV sites with batteries. And you can see how they sort of help us in the morning peak period and in the evening peak. But then during the midday, they're sort of operating down near zero dispatch, but they're just responding to the solar only sites. help prevent frequency from getting more unstable. And then the one shade of light blue there is our single largest thermal generating unit. So when it goes down to 0, we're at 100%. It's operating as a synchronous condenser, and it comes back on in the afternoon and up for the evening peak. And so this was 8 hours and 15 minutes at 100%. Just to note, we do have a project in the works right now where we're going to be adding some battery storage to those 3 utility scale PV sites. So we'll be able to get rid of a lot of this variability, solidify our frequency during the midday, and free up more dispatch for future solar and battery projects. Next slide shows 3 days later, lots of dark clouds and rain. You can see the difference. We basically just had a little bit of solar throughout the day. You can see the green lines. You can see our battery sites, the purple and pink, gave us a little bit of help during the morning peak, but really stayed at 0 the whole day. We weren't even able to get much charge in them for the evening peak. So they just stayed at 0 all the way through the night. And we had to run our diesel generators. You can see us starting up 3 of them after the end of the morning peak there, the shades of blue. So this is the challenges of operating a grid like this. We're not planning to retire any of our conventional generating units. Like I said, we'll just change out the fuel that they burn to biodiesel eventually. But in the meantime, we need those, especially on an islanded system like ours, where you have to make sure the lights stay on. Okay, next slide. So when we're operating in a high inverter-based resource situation, 3 primary concerns: inertia, voltage support, and fault current. And so the solutions we've been employing is the synchronous condenser, which I mentioned. And on the right there, you see a picture of our GE LM2500 unit, which is the one that we converted to add a synchronous condenser capability while still maintaining its ability to operate in normal mode and normal real power mode. And so we, by having that, we are able to maintain some additional inertia on the grid. We have its automatic voltage regulator to support voltage, and then we have the fault current capability of that large generator. And that last one, the fault current, was really our primary concern, because we've proven that we can control voltage quite well with our inverter-based resources. We can even get, I guess my concern for inertia has evolved over the years, is inverter-based resources can provide real power very quickly. So in my mind, you either need inertia or you need speed. Ideally, you have both, but we've been able to mitigate the low inertia, weak grid aspects by having very fast-acting battery systems behind our inverters. But that fault current is critical, because our entire relay protective system on all grids depend on the ability for any sort of faults on the power lines to recognize high amounts of fault current so that they can trip open and clear the fault, if you will, make that grid safe, or maintain its safety. Grid forming technology was another possible solution to these concerns. And so we can go to the next slide. We have been working with 2 different sites that have been operating as grid forming. Our first one was since 2018, which was a Tesla site. You can see the picture down in the lower left, and it's using Power Pack 2s. This is pre-Megapack. And we have seen that site respond quite well to many grid events and transients over the years. I should say that we've had installed high-speed data recorders all over our system for well over a decade. So anytime there's an event, we can pull up the records and we can see, how did this site respond? How did that site respond? How did our conventional generators respond? How did our batteries respond? And we've seen really good response from the Tesla site operating in its virtual machine mode. We do see an inertia-like response And we've even seen on some island-wide blackouts where it was the last plant to remain online, even after our conventional machines have tripped. We also converted one of our DC-coupled solar and battery sites, the AES site, to GFM in mid-2022. And that happens to be located on a Navy base that is at the end of a single transmission line. And so it's got a seamless islanding capability as well. That's why we're running it in GFM primarily, because if the transmission line goes down, the plant is oversized compared to the Navy base loads, and so it can remain online without the transmission line and continue to power the Navy base. And so that is that site, and then we're going to be converting our last solar and battery site to GFM soon, but we're recognizing a little bit of a difference between balanced and unbalanced faults. And so we just want to further understand some before we go ahead and convert that. I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah, that is all. Thank you for having me. Look forward to the questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. We're starting to get some good questions rolling in. All right, so we'll have Ulrich present last, and then we will move to questions. So take it away, Ulrich.
Thank you very much. Let me first see. Can you see my screen?
Not. Oh, yeah. Now. Yep.
Perfect. Good. Thanks so much for inviting me. And I agree that the order of the presentation is perfect, because I want to build a little bit on the topics that Julia and Brett have been talking about stability and how can we operate systems that are dominated by inverter-based resources, and sharing a little bit my experience, both from starting from microgrids and smaller projects, but also then ranging to much larger transmission systems. That's, of course, as you can see on the slide, joint work with many different entities on different projects. Just highlighting here a few. I've been working with Hawaiian Electric, PNNL, Opal RT, EPRI, Sandia National Lab, and Manitoba Hydro and Electronics, and also grateful, of course, for financial support from the Department of Energy. I would like to start actually with a little story where I'm coming from. So I have my daughter's in first grade here in elementary school, and we had a STEAM day a few weeks back, and then they asked me if I could give them an overview. What do you do at work, right? So what do the parents do? Topic was sustainability, and I said, okay, I have to think a little bit about how to explain a first grader what we do. And out of this kind of thinking and trying to explain things in a much more simpler way, I thought, okay, maybe there are two ways to consider this for kids. And this is about thinking about ducks and thinking about moose. The duck project is to many of you, because all of you are familiar with California, and we talk about high renewable integration and how the power systems. And Brett actually had the nice example of the Kauai Island, where I think the curve looks the residual generation or the generation from your conventional generation use, and it looks quite similar, right? But it's just one piece of the equation we're looking at when we look at grid forming. And the other piece may or may not be less known to you, but it was a big topic in the 90s, actually, in Germany. And I guess some of you may know this is the first time probably I remember seeing really control and stability becoming a huge thing that went through the media up and down. Of course, for Mercedes-Benz at that time, I think it was in 97, was a huge disaster, I would say, at least on the marketing side. And you can actually see how the car almost flips over here. And it's actually interesting. The solution to this is a control problem, right? And even though this is a car and not a power system, it does have some parallels to the problem that we're looking at when we look at grid forming inverters. So I want to quickly take you through three main topics. I will start with why do we need grid forming inverters? And I think some of this was already covered in the previous presentation, so I think we can do this quite quickly. I will talk a bit about the challenges, which again, Hofer has already been addressed. And then at the end, I want to give a small outlook into how this may look like maybe in the future. Maybe a little bit about my background. I work for Siemens, but I work in Siemens Technology. So we are the pre-development and R&D arm of Siemens. So I'm looking at the one hand on real projects with our business units. We worked on, for example, Galapagos Island, how to convert this into 100% renewable generation. And so looking like 5-10 years ahead, usually using government funding, and then of course other partners like Hawaii in this case, to see how could the future of those systems look like and what are products that customers will need in the future would look like. So what is this needed? When you think about future systems with higher inverter-based generation, I know, of course, the rail well, that's a big topic here for Alaska. Brett, of course, you had very nice examples of this. There are many different problems. You have to think about power balance. You were talking about storage and long-term storage. Power transfer is another big issue, I think less in islands like Kauai, but of course, I would assume also in Alaska, and of course, the bigger the system is, your generation is not where you load this, so you need additional transmission capacity, or at least you need solutions. Could be non-hardware solutions, could be storage, different ways for that. And last but not least, system stability, N-1 security, system protection. Brad, you had this on your last slides. So this is really a big topic, and the grid forming inverter is primarily solving this last topic, not the other ones. Of course, if you combine it with battery storage, you can also work on the other issues. And just again, to underline and emphasize this point, why it is actually relevant already today. I brought you here two charts. Left-hand side is from Ireland. What you can see here, let me see if I can give you a pointer. Can you see my pointer, right? So this is actually already 4 years ago from Ireland. You see the month of February. You can see here is the light green curve is the wind generation. Red is the load. You can see here basically dips almost every day. And if you look at one day in particular, you see here always a dip at night. The wind is curtailed, obviously, because you need to have a certain gap between the green and the red curve. Apparently, Brett, you're much smarter than the guys in Ireland, or your system is maybe smaller. Ireland is about 100 times, 80 times the size, I think, of Kauai. So it's about 5 gigawatt, I think, peak, more or less. So what you see here, that obviously this gets required too much, but to my knowledge, at least they're not running 100% inverter base, not even for 30 minutes as of today. This left-hand side picture is from Maui. Is a picture that I got an electric 10% roughly of solar generation that is primarily, not only, but primarily also due to stability considerations that you cannot operate a system with a higher level of inverter-based generation. Portability is already today an issue, which leads us to reduce renewable generation, to curtail it. And if we can resolve this with inverter-based grid forming inverters, that would help us tremendously already today. Now, grid forming, I think, has been discussed sufficiently. I want to take you a little bit into one example that we did with Siemens. This may be a video I showed you at the beginning with the car flipping over. This is kind of the same story. What you see here was a test we did in 2018. It was 6 grid forming inverters, actually all nicely collocated in one place. But what you heard, this click, 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 is basically the inverters fighting against each other and the whole thing basically creating a power outage, right? So here are the power oscillations. And I was excited because usually when we talk about power systems and oscillations, we have these plots, but there's nothing visually attractive that you can show, right? So here at least you have an audio representation of it. So the system that we looked at and that we have seen in the previous video is the one that you see here on the top right. So you have 6 parallel grid forming inverters. In this case, we were feeding into a load bank. It was a test that we did before connecting a real customer feeder. The system is fairly small. It's about 300, all 6 inverters together, 300 kilowatt size. So it was more really for testing and then connecting one residential feeder. The learning here, maybe taking you quickly through what we see at the bottom is there was an initial parameterization of the inverter controls, and you can see here these oscillations, which is kind of in the video. And then what we did in order to fix this, you do manual tuning. Yeah, and then these oscillations going away, and then of course you redo this experiment and you see, okay, now we can operate the system. The thesis we did later on, and I will talk a little bit more about this later, is can we actually automate this manual tuning process because it's so time consuming? So we came up with optimization algorithms that would do this automatically. Now, what is the learning from this is that, well, everybody's grid forming can support the system. I mentioned this nicely before, but they also can become unstable. So we have to know what we are doing. Second part is the stability depends on software, not on hardware. And Brett gave an example with synchronous condensers. That's kind of the safe way how to do it today. And I recommend you build a system today. That's probably the safest way to build it in that size, because you're still relying on the tools that we have been used to over decades. Eventually, at least I personally think where we should try to get is to understand how can we operate a system only with inverters to address the protection concerns that Brett mentioned, and of course also to make sure the system is always stable and N-1 secure. The main problem here is that this is very time consuming. That's the learning we took here, but also from looking at others. You have to do a lot of simulations. It takes much longer than in the past. And this is still an ongoing R&D effort actually to identify how to speed this up. Now, taking this more in a structured way. So what are the challenges that we need to address? So coming from grid forming inverters, and Julia gave a nice overview of the different requirements that are coming in, we have to understand what happens if we interconnect many of these inverters. And of course, we get these intergenerator oscillations that I've just shown you in the previous slides. There are many other topics going from simulation to understand behavior and the like. When we go, and my title was about going from microgrid to transmission system. For microgrid, this is definitely enough. I'm not sure, Brett, how much you did, but I'm sure you did a lot of simulation studies. I know you did some work with NREL together to analyze some of these stabilities. So this is kind of to some size you can get here. But if you look into larger systems, these are time varying eigenmodes. So the way how your system oscillates between different generators depends, of course, which generators are online and which are offline. So during the night, when you have mostly conventional generation, and during the day, when you have mostly solar generation, or maybe in a large system where you sometimes have solar generation in the south, and then later in the day, you're in the north, the way how your system oscillates is changing over time, over hours and days. This is something we are not used to today. Today, synchronous generators, the large power plants run 24/7 on large systems. So this is something which changes and we have to address in one way. And one strategy that we have developed a little bit later is the dynamic N-1 security optimization, which is a tool that runs in parallel to the operation and continuously adjusts your system. Going back to the car example I showed you at the beginning. So you're continuously optimizing your car because the car is kind of changing. The wheels of your cars are like the different generators. And the car continuously changes its way, how it's flipping left and right. So you have continuously changing your controller parameters. Again, this is research, but it's an idea how this could be solved in the future. Before I want to give you one quick glimpse into very recent activities that we did and also addressing Brett's topic earlier about protection. So this is a project we just started very recently, and it looks into protection of low inertia systems. And specifically, what we did there was an analysis. We did expert interviews and a literature review. How can we solve protection challenges for inverter-dominated transmission systems? There is work done on microgrids, there's work done on distribution systems, but specifically thinking of large transmission systems. And the findings maybe were not too surprising for people to look into this. So you can have non-sinusoidal voltages and currents from the grid-forming inverters. They tend to oscillate against each other, what I've shown you previously. If you looked into grid-forming inverters, the control functions usually is very carefully protected by the manufacturers. They don't want to share it. If you look at the fault right through functions, how they run through faults, this is even more protected, and you can only barely basically guess what they are doing. And all the standards that you look at today focus for protection and fault right through, focus on grid following inverters and not grid forming inverters. So there is a significant gap, and interestingly, there's also barely any research in that field. So that's why we are now collaborative working again with Hawaiian Electric, but also with EPRI, Sandia, and other partners to understand which FRT functions are actually supporting the protection behavior, how maybe protection has to change, or which protection functions are successful in these kind of operation modes when you have only inverters in your system. And we are looking also into analysis and design tools that jointly look at the fault right through functions of the grid forming inverters and the protection settings. So, again, this is ongoing research. It's not something where I have results to show, unfortunately, this time, but I'm very much looking forward that maybe in the future I can share this with you. So going back to the question about N-1 stability and how we can ensure this for large systems. That was a project we worked on, again, with Hawaiian Electric, Pacific Northwestern National Lab, and Opal RT. And we actually built a demonstrator that can show how such a system could look like. Again, think of a scenario. You have a varying amounts of inverter-based resources. Maybe during the day, it's more solar. During the night, it's more conventional generation. So we built up a real-time simulation of them from Hawaii, Big Island. It's a hypothetical case how this could look like in actually very few years, because they install a lot of battery and solar systems. And then we built a trip. Yeah? So we have a standard energy management system, and we have an operator support system, which first analyzes the oscillations in the systems, then optimizes the controller parameters. And if the result basically shows, yes, this is a more stable system, we send those parameters down into the system and stabilize it. This kind of loop that you have here is not running in seconds or minutes. It was a requirement to have something that you can adjust parameters of the inverters, but you do this just maybe every 50 minutes, maybe every hour, maybe whenever your generation mix changes significantly. And so it's not real-time communication, but it's something you set your system. It's like the car example I showed at the beginning. You set the parameters of the different inverters to make sure the system is sufficiently stable. And then whenever something happens, the system is stable by itself. You don't need to respond in real time. That project finished last year. Had a good perception, I would say, also from many different other utilities. Again, it's a research project. It's not really something that I would say is real life as of today, but we wanted to see how far we can go and can we actually do this in a real system. Looking back into what Brad presented, I mean, obviously for smaller islanded systems, maybe including Hawaii, this online optimization is not really the right tool. But if you think of larger systems like definitely like Western interconnection or so, then these are topics that definitely will come up. For Alaska, I'm unfortunately not well enough aware of the system of the rail belt, if that is needed or not. Maybe something we can discuss later. This shows some of the results. So we looked at different operation scenarios. There are different loads, like a noon case, evening case, and night case. We have different inverter-based resource penetration. So there's 100%, 90%, 80% inverter-based resources. And you can see here examples without the operator support system and with the operator support system and different contingencies. That what you can see. The left cases are more oscillatory, and then on the right-hand side, we see that these oscillations have been done successfully. Yeah? It's just a snapshot. We, of course, as I said, this is a demonstrator, so it runs actually in real life. I would have a video, but I think given the time, I will skip this today. And rather summarize to share with you. Grid forming inverters are a very good resource to stabilize power systems, especially when we're decarbonizing the grid. But we have to know what we are doing. And especially this change that I said earlier is it's determined by software instead of hardware. This makes also, we have to rethink some of the tools that we have been working with and understand going from RMS to EMT and so on. The challenge so far, in my perspective, the biggest challenge when you look at stability, especially for large systems, is you need extensive simulations. And this at some point is just not manageable anymore. And this is actually finding scalable solutions from my perspective is one of the biggest R&D challenges right now. There are ongoing efforts, for example, within the Unify consortium. I actually just had a meeting today talking about this, but I wouldn't say there is one silver bullet that I can present you that this will be the solution for this. I think it's really an active field of research to identify what's the best approach. And with this, thank you very much. And then, Mari, I guess you will take us through the panel.
Yep. Thank you very much, Ulrich. And you can turn your video back on. It may not have been your video after all, so we might as well be able to look at you. Hopefully, if you have any questions to answer, we won't lose you during the middle of the very important part of it. Okay, so we have a lot of comments coming through here, and some of them people are directly answering in the chat. So so I encourage everybody to be reading the chat, and not only for your own answers, but others. But there's a common thread in some of the questions, so I'm kind of going to combine them, and that's related to specific challenges on the rail belt. Oftentimes, you know, we see examples of operation of GFM in other, you know, maybe perhaps more compact systems, but the rail belt is long and skinny. I'm going to ask in the response to this question, if maybe for some of those who aren't power systems engineers, you could talk about what are the particular challenges that might be encountered in a long and skinny system. Nominally, I understand there's, you know, the power transfer stability question, and maybe that's part of it. And so then the question becomes, to what extent does the benefits of grid forming inverters translate to the particular challenges of a long and skinny system? And so for any of these questions, yeah, that's what I want. People jump in if you have thoughts on this, and then we can go to other people if they have thoughts. Otherwise, we move to the next question. So, Julia.
Yeah, so from long and skinny systems, I wanted to kind of kick it off because ORCAD system, it's not quite as skinny if if you think just longitudinally, but it is a kind of dispersed system with a lot of synchronous generation located on the east side of the grid, and then inverter-based resources, good wind and solar conditions are on the west, and also west part of grid has less load, and so basically like parts of the grid were not even ORCAD before renewables started developing. So this results in really weak conditions on the grid. So basically what weak grid means is sensitivity of voltage to injection of current. And so if you are far away from strong voltage source, being a traditional synchronous generator, then there is more sensitivity and there is easier, you get kind of voltage gets unstable in those areas. And then another issue is, Mari, like you mentioned, is long distance power transfer. And so this is kind of steady state voltage stability problem. And so for the first problem, grid forming inverters are a good solution. For the second problem, it doesn't help because it's still kind of your resources, your part of the grid is electrically close from where power needs to flow, and that has a limit of how much power you can transfer from voltage stability perspective. But I'm thinking now, and I'm not sure why. So, for example, ORCAD didn't look at that, but say because batteries, they are not quite bound to be built in certain areas. So we were building wind and solar in the areas that are rich in resource, and maybe batteries, grid forming batteries, can be built kind of along those long transmission lines. And I'm thinking like by breaking up that grid, you can actually maybe solve that problem by basically locating. I think Ulrich also mentioned by locating batteries along the lines, you can help solve those issues.
Does anybody else have input on that particular question?
I'll jump in. I mean, it seems like obviously it's much longer, and I believe the rail belt is is it a single circuit, or do you have two circuits on the same set of poles, that rail belt transmission line?
Boy, I think it is. I think one set of poles is one circuit, but if there is anybody, like I know Felicia is on the line. Felicia could put in the chat maybe what the answer to that question is.
Something I've always wondered about is I know we have areas where we have one set of poles, but there's, we're sort of hanging 3 phases on one side, 3 phases on the other, and we got 2 circuits. So we technically have N-1 unless somebody takes a pole out. Okay, single in most places, yeah.
Great, thank you, Bill.
So yeah, I mean, when I think about your situation, maybe you could have kind of similar to how we have that one GFM site at the end of a single transmission line. So if you had, on each end, or maybe on the end where you don't have as much generation resources, you have a GFM capable plant, so that when that transmission system goes down, you might be able to continue to operate or mitigate the impacts of that line going down.
I think also, Julia, Finland might have a similar situation, maybe not stretched top to bottom, but east to west, where they have a lot of wind and not a lot of load in the west and a lot of load in the east.
Yeah, similar situation. That's also why they're looking at grid forming as well in the weak grid areas.
And they have officially released requirements, right?
Yes, they have. So last year, as I said, it's a very sneaky way, actually. It's not a grid code requirement. If you look at it, is a study requirement. So if you are to build an inverter-based resource in what they consider weak grid area, then you have to do a certain amount of studies and basically show that your resource is grid forming, or otherwise you cannot connect. But this year, I know they released a new version of the grid code, and I believe they put in grid forming requirements in there as well. But I haven't had a chance to review yet. It's in Finnish.
Okay. Okay, so let's jump to the next topic that got a lot of feedback, and there have been some that responses put here, but is the conversion of existing grid following assets to grid forming. It sounds like that with the Tesla Megapacks, this is possible. So maybe actually, Brad, maybe you could speak about
Sure.
the two cases where you've done it. How difficult, expensive was this?
Yeah, I mean, we were fortunate on the Tesla site, and again, that's Power Pack 2s. But I think essentially the inverter technology is not too different from the current Megapack offering, just that it's more integrated. But being one of the first, I think Tesla was happy that they had a willing customer that was willing to do this, especially on an islanded grid where we could test it out. So the cost was little to nothing. I don't know if they want me to really talk about that. So, yeah, I don't know what they would charge for that now, or if there is a premium. I'm not really sure. We're currently in a contract to get some Tesla Megapacks to adding those to those utility scale solar PV sites that I mentioned in my presentation, and I don't recall them kind of highlighting that as an additional adder. So I think it's something you're going to want, just out of the gate. I mean, I don't see any reason to not do it. I don't think the cost is significant, if anything. And from my standpoint, it's always been just kind of a firmware change. Now, the other inverter manufacturer at the AES sites that we have, those are a little different setup because they're DC coupled, so a little bit more challenging. Those inverters are having to manage the input voltage from the PV and the batteries and convert it to AC, whereas the Tesla site is just focused on the battery side that's AC coupled, and on the PV side there's Toshiba, Mitsubishi inverters, so not grid forming or anything like that. They're just a traditional solar inverter. But the AES DC coupled sites, we converted one to GFM, and through that I've realized there are many flavors of GFM. So the responses we're seeing in the high-speed data captures of those inverters are more like just a traditional frequency droop. I mean, yeah, I know that they're providing that voltage source, and they operate a little bit. They respond a little bit faster than the GFL, because now we're seeing the same inverter, one GFL, one GFM. You get maybe a response in like 1 to 2 cycles as opposed to 2 to 3 cycles. I mean that's all fast, but it's more just a traditional frequency droop response as compared to the Tesla site, which is sort of providing this inertial like response. Now that manufacturer has said they have developed a synchronous inertia type GFM, and they would like to test that out. So we're going to start talking with them about upgrading to that. But that's just, there's a lot of different tweaking you can do with this. And I would hope that the industry would sort of get to a standard level offering, kind of like thinking about traditional generators, standard droop response, standard sort of governor response, if you will. But each site might require a little bit of tweaking because maybe you're connecting to the continental bulk power system versus, over here, we're connecting to an islanded system. So you might want a little more aggressive or less aggressive response.
I think that, my opinion, and I think I would also have this as a takeaway from this talk, and that is one of the biggest challenges really is going to be is software. Like Ulrich, you said, it's control interactions and tuning, and what level of effort is required, what level of effort is practical. Can we afford to run thousands and thousands and thousands of simulations? But the flip side is it realistic to think that we could come up with some analytical approaches? So I don't know what the answers are. I do think that maybe, what we could do is offer some, guidance of what we know now. And so I'll throw it out to the group, if I am procuring a grid forming asset, what are the control parameters that are most likely to need to be able to be tweaked in the field, and that I should request? Is that a question that I can even ask because it's different from between every single inverter, or is there sort of a few parameters that are sort of boiling to the top and tend to need to be adjusted, more often than others? So I will throw that out to anybody who wants to answer.
I mean, I can give my thoughts, but I think Julia or Brett, you may have even more practical experience. There is not one model for all grid forming, right? Brett mentioned this already. Most of them are black boxed. WEC has now released kind of a requirement for generic models that I think they require grid forming inverters to follow within the Western interconnection. That's actually a topic I'm proposing or suggesting since quite some time. We need insights into those models. As long as you have, and maybe Brett, you can talk about this, if you have black box models, usually defined models, or actually generic models, if you have models from the inverters and they don't give you any white box models, it is very difficult to come up with any analytic or whatever suggestions. It is simulation. Yeah. So first step is getting generic models. I'm not saying it's one. My best example is always look at power system stabilizers. There are IEEE recommended practices. You have a list of 10, 15, 20 different models. They can throw in as many as they want and just say my inverter behaves like model 27. And then you have something that you can use. There are some approaches to speed this up. I'm personally a bit concerned how to do this. Now, coming to your question about how to tune it, again, depends very much on the controller. Usually, I think there are two main parameters. One is the droop, so how steady state behavior. And the other one is kind of how aggressive the inverter responds with power, active power jump, load steps, and so on, right? And the problem is, of course, if you have one inverter and it's aggressive, you can just clean it out quickly. And maybe one is aggressive, the other one is not. Then they start oscillating against each other. And this is, from my experience, it's very for a smaller system, it's still okay. You talked about the long Raybell system. So if you imagine you have two grid forming inverters on each side, this is a certain risk that they start oscillating if you don't properly tune it. And of course, the more complex the system, the more difficult it is to build statements. I wouldn't even know if you say if everybody is equally aggressive and has equally droop gains, if this is always stable, I'm not sure even about it.
Yeah, glad. I mean, that's the classic control system issue, right? It's steady state versus transient response. And, you don't want too aggressive. Otherwise, you're going to go unstable during steady state, but you want aggressive enough so that when you have a transient, you get the response before you go black. And, looking back, we had sort of, it's embarrassing in hindsight, but when we added our first battery, utility scale battery on our system, it was a 6 megawatt battery. And so knowing that, we're averaging about 50 to 60 megawatts and we peak at 80, we said, we want this droop to be very aggressive on this battery because we want it to go to 100% output before we ever reach our under frequency load shed scheme. Otherwise, what's the point, So we set a 0.8% droop on this unit so that it could go to full output, before we started load shedding at 59.2 hertz. And then, and that worked fine. And then we added another battery. And of course, we said, well, we wanted to, be very aggressive as well, because now we have our single largest generator is 26 megawatts. So we add 6 plus this 13 and that worked fine. And we added another one and we're kind of stupid and not thinking and continued to operate with this very aggressive droop. And eventually we got to the point where we had 47 megawatts of battery on our system at 0.8% droop. And that was not good one day when we started having some oscillations and we caused a blackout. And fortunately on the island, we're not afraid of blackouts. We can restore everyone in about 1 to 2 hours. So it's not good to say this to the customers, but it's really cool when that kind of stuff happens because you learn a lot. And we understood, we got to see some of these inverters that the phase lock loop basically was faulted, and we learned a lot, and the inverter manufacturers learned a lot, and eventually those sites went to zero, and it's a very complicated issue. But that was in April of 21, and immediately after that, the problem was clear. Why the heck are we operating these things at such an aggressive droop? And we, ordered all of them to relax to 3% droop, and we haven't seen any significant oscillations anywhere close to that since then. So that's one very easy fix. And then later we and we added another site to GFM, and we can look at like the PLL gains and some of the different other tuning parameters. But the simplest one is just, understanding your system and knowing about that trade-off between steady state versus transient response.
Julie, do you have any input on that control tuning / parameter question?
Not on that, but it's even, I've been thinking about it lately. It's even related to conventional inverter-based resources. I think it's like we're kind of past the time where you can just plug and forget kind of approach that, the more inverter-based resources you add to grid forming or grid following, you will need to go back and restudy inverters, like groups of inverters, and looking at, parameter tuning. Or I wonder if industry will ever accept adaptive type of controls, but that would ease the job of engineers if, if these resources could kind of like feel, and you can be even switching between like weaker grid conditions to stronger grid conditions, and you need like different sets of parameters for different conditions. You cannot even like set and forget for a few years. That may not even be practical. So basically, we'll need to find ways to restudy and retune, but maybe even adaptive control at some point. Also, Mari, maybe I'd like to add in terms of you were saying like asking for control parameters. From just my experience, what I'm seeing in the industry, I think people currently asking, for a certain amount of inertia or a certain amount of short circuit current. And to over-explain, like oftentimes amount of short circuit current that they're asking for is not necessarily for protection. And like Brett also was saying, like on the island, protection is important and important to have like certain level of short circuit current. But in other areas, it's because the metric that we use for system strengths is this short circuit level. People translate it to short circuit current contribution from grid forming inverters, and that not necessarily values grid forming inverters for stability benefits that they provide. So when people go and provide so much short circuit current for system strengths, maybe that's not short circuit current that you need.
Okay, let's see. I have a question here from Amy at AVEC. Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. Since stability is a limiting factor to these integrations, have you seen any loosening of the regulatory requirements for system electrical parameters, frequency or voltage, for smaller scale IBR/DFM systems? It seems that if such systems could be regulated as a different, it seems that such systems could be regulated at a different category than large grids for the regulations to be both realistic and not prohibitive. So have we seen in any places where, requirements are loosening on small systems, perhaps?
I haven't seen what they are loosening, but I've seen where they are looser than what we have. So we were looking in ORCAD actually for if you can reduce under frequency, when under frequency load shedding starts, then theoretically you need much less inertia on the grid. And we looked into that and we couldn't find historically why it's set where it's set. But if you look at Europe, for example, they operate at much wider frequency range without load shedding. And so obviously there is no reliability reason. So there is some kind of like historic design, and now nobody knows what may trip if you operate at lower frequencies, and all equipment has been designed to that level. So it's maybe like just history is there, and therefore kind of inertia in parameters is there as well.
Okay, so I'm being told that that was our last question because we have to end. There is just one more question that if anybody here has a chance to answer it in chat, it's related to reactive power oscillations. I think we're starting to see a lot of challenges with reactive power oscillations in some of these smaller systems that are getting deployed out there. So if any of you have feedback on that, you can reply to the chat. Other than that, I think we are at end of time, and thank you all so much for contributing to this panel. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Mari.
Thank you
Yes,
very much.
absolutely. Thank you so much to the panel that we just had and to all of our presenters and panelists for sharing their time and their expertise. This workshop would not have been possible without you. And also a big thank you to all of you for joining us for the Betting Big, Investing in Emerging Energy Technology virtual workshop, sponsored by the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. The recording of this workshop will be available on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com in about a week. Please continue to check back for more information. We'll also be sending out a short survey following this workshop and would love your feedback. You can access the survey by scanning the QR code on the screen with your camera phone, and we'll also drop a link in the chat now. As a reminder, everyone who completes the survey will be entered to win one 3-day conference ticket to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in May. The winner can select either an in-person or virtual ticket. Please take a moment to get your short survey submitted to help the planning committee improve future workshops. We appreciate all of the incredible presenters and virtual attendees. Of course, we hope to see you all at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference at the Denina Center in Anchorage on May 21st to the 23rd. Both in-person and virtual tickets are available for the conference, and we hope you'll consider joining us. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.